Tonight, I have 12 true stories from the 1980s, a decade where the bright neon lights often hid very deep and very dark secrets. You are going to hear about crimes of privilege, cold-blooded assassinations, and a holiday execution that changed history. If you enjoy strange, dark, and mysterious stories told in a calm, steady way, please subscribe and let me know in the comments where you are listening from tonight. As for the like button, treat it like a heavy oak door in a dimly lit hallway. You don't need to know what is hiding in the room behind it or why the floorboards are creaking on the other side. You are much better off just giving the handle a quick, firm tap and moving along into the light. Now, turn the lights down low, get as comfortable as you can, and listen to the sound of the rain as we begin our first story. On the early morning of August 26, 1986, a cyclist was pedaling through the quiet, winding paths of Central Park in New York. The air was thick with the humid heat of a late summer dawn that felt like a damp blanket over the city. As he rounded a bend behind the Metropolitan Museum of Art, he noticed something pale and motionless on the grass. It looked like a discarded mannequin at first, but as he drew closer, the reality became clear. The figure lying in the grass was 18-year-old Jennifer Levin. Her denim jacket had been ripped nearly in half, and her clothing was in complete disarray. Her skin was cold to the touch, and the morning dew was beginning to settle on her face. The cyclist stood over her for a long moment, his heart racing against his ribs as the silence of the park seemed to grow heavier. He realized there was nothing he could do for her, so he turned his bike and rode hard to find help. Jennifer Levin was a bright, social 18-year-old who had just graduated from a prestigious high school. She was known for her wide circle of friends and her ability to make anyone feel like they were the most important person in the room. That summer was supposed to be her final stretch of freedom before she headed off to college in the fall. On that Monday evening, she had dressed up and headed to a popular local hangout called Dorian's Red Hand to meet her friends. Inside the bar, the music was loud and the air was filled with the smell of expensive cologne and beer. It was the kind of place where the children of the city's elite went to feel safe and seen. Jennifer moved through the crowd with her usual ease, laughing and catching up with people she had known for years. Around midnight, she noticed a young man she had seen around the neighborhood. He was tall and athletic, with the kind of classic good looks that people noticed. The young man was 20-year-old Robert Chambers. He had attended some of the best private schools in Manhattan and moved through high society with an easy, practiced confidence. To most people, he was the ultimate golden boy, a student at a good university who seemed to have a perfectly mapped-out future. Jennifer and Robert started talking near the bar, their conversation quickly becoming intense. They spent the next few hours huddled together, ignoring the rest of the room. At around 4:30 in the morning, the lights in the bar began to flicker, signaling that it was time for everyone to head home. Jennifer and Robert walked out onto the sidewalk together into the warm, quiet air. The city was unusually still at that hour, with only a few yellow cabs cruising the empty avenues. They stood there for a moment, deciding what to do next. Instead of going their separate ways, they decided to walk toward the dark trees of Central Park. You are walking through the entrance of the park and onto the grass behind the museum. At that hour, the park is empty of the usual crowds of tourists and joggers. It is just the two of you under the heavy shadows of the large oaks. For a while, the night feels perfectly normal and calm. But then, the tone of the conversation begins to shift. Robert's polite demeanor starts to fade, replaced by something much more aggressive. No one else is around to hear the struggle. Back at the scene of the discovery, the detectives arrived and were struck by the sheer violence of the area. It was clear that this was not a random mugging or a theft gone wrong. Jennifer's purse was still there, and she was still wearing her jewelry. They found several pieces of evidence nearby, including a small piece of paper with a name on it. As they processed the damp grass, they began to piece together who she was and who she had been with just hours before. The investigators started by talking to the staff and the regulars who had been at Dorian's that night. Everyone remembered seeing Jennifer with the handsome young man in the expensive clothes. They quickly learned his name was Robert Chambers. When the detectives went to Robert's home later that day, they found him sitting in his bedroom. He looked remarkably calm, but the detectives noticed deep, fresh scratching. Robert was taken down to the station for questioning. At first, he tried to act like he had no idea why the police were there. He claimed that he had left the bar alone and gone straight home to sleep. When the detectives asked about the vertical scratches on his face, he hesitated for a second. He then told them that his cat had scratched him while he was trying to play with it. The detectives looked at each other, knowing those wounds were much too wide for a cat. As the pressure in the small room grew, Robert's story began to fall apart. He eventually admitted that he had gone into the park with Jennifer, but he insisted that whatever happened was a complete accident. He told the detectives that Jennifer had wanted to have rough sex, and that she had started hurting him first. He claimed that he had only grabbed her by the throat to push her away and stop her. This was the birth of what would become a very famous defense. This rough sex defense was a calculated move to shift the blame from the killer back onto the victim. Robert claimed that Jennifer was the aggressor and that he was simply a victim of a situation that got out of control. He told the police that after she stopped moving, he got scared and just walked home. He did not call for help or try to see if she was still breathing. He just left her there in the dirt behind the museum and went to bed like nothing had happened. The case immediately became a massive sensation in the New York tabloids. The media began to focus on Jennifer's personal life, suggesting that her choice to go into the park at night meant she was partially responsible for her own death. This was a classic tactic of the defense team, led by a lawyer named Jack Littman. They wanted the jury to believe that Jennifer was a wild girl who enjoyed dangerous games. They turned the trial into an attack on her character. While the newspapers focused on the gossip, the forensic team was looking at the physical facts of the body. The medical examiner found that the pressure required to cause those specific injuries was far more than a simple push. It would have taken several minutes of sustained, intense force to kill her. There were also signs that she had been dragged across the grass for several yards. The physical evidence did not match Robert's story of an accidental, panicked grab. As the trial approached, the public started to see the real Robert Chambers. He was not actually the perfect, high-society student he pretended to be in his press photos. He had been kicked out of several schools for stealing and for drug use. He had a history of petty crimes and lies that his family had managed to keep quiet for years. He was a young man who had spent his entire life using his looks and his status to get out of trouble whenever it found him. During the investigation, a disturbing piece of evidence surfaced that the public never forgot. A friend of Robert's had recorded a video of him at a party shortly after the murder. In the video, Robert was seen playing with a doll and mocking the way Jennifer looked when she was dying. He was laughing and joking about the strangulation with his friends. This video showed a complete lack of remorse and a level of cruelty that made the accident story very hard to believe. The trial lasted for several weeks and was filled with intense tension. The courtroom was always packed with friends of both the victim and the defendant, creating a divided atmosphere. Jennifer's parents had to sit through hours of testimony that dragged their daughter's name through the mud for the sake of a legal strategy. They listened to experts debate the mechanics of a chokehold and the meaning of a torn denim jacket, while Robert sat quietly at the table. The jury spent 9 long days deliberating the case. They were deeply divided over whether the killing was intentional murder or a lower charge of manslaughter. The pressure was immense, and the jurors were becoming exhausted and frustrated with each other. It seemed like the case might end in a mistrial, which would have meant starting the entire painful process over. Both sides were worried about the outcome, so they decided to enter into negotiations for a deal. In the end, Robert Chambers agreed to plead guilty to first-degree manslaughter. He admitted that he had intended to cause physical injury to Jennifer, and that his actions directly led to her death. This deal meant he would avoid a potential life sentence for murder. He was sentenced to 5 to 15 years in prison. Many people felt that this was a very light punishment for taking a life so brutally. Jennifer's family was left with the feeling that justice was not served. Robert's time in prison was not quiet or productive. He continued to struggle with drug addiction and was frequently in trouble with the prison authorities for breaking the rules. He was caught with heroin and other contraband multiple times, which extended his stay behind bars. He never seemed to grasp the gravity of what he had done to the Levin family. He remained the same entitled young man who believed that the rules were things that only applied to other people. Robert was eventually released in 2003 after serving the full 15 years of his sentence. However, his freedom did not last very long. Within a few years, he was arrested again, this time for running a large-scale drug operation out of his apartment in the city. He was sentenced to 19 more years in prison. It seemed that he was unable to function in a world where he could not manipulate people. His life became a cycle of prison and failure. It is a strange thing to realize how much weight a person's appearance carries in our society. Robert Chambers was given the benefit of the doubt by so many people, simply because he looked like he belonged on a television show. If he had looked different, the story of what happened in the park might have been told very differently from the start. We often want to believe that monsters do not wear well-tailored suits, but the history of this city proves that they often do. In July of 2023, Robert Chambers was released from prison for the second time. He is now 60 years old and has spent more than half of his life behind bars for various crimes. As the spring of 2026 settles over the streets of Manhattan, he remains a man followed by the long shadow of his own history. He is living out his days under the quiet but constant watch of the state's parole officers, a shadow of the boy he once was. Jennifer Levin never got to see her 19th birthday or experience the life she had worked so hard to build. Her name is forever linked to a tragedy and a legal strategy that tried to erase who she was. The spot behind the museum in Central Park is beautiful and quiet today, with no sign of the struggle that took place 40 years ago. But for those who remember that summer, the air there always feels a little bit heavier. Her story is a reminder of how easily light is lost. While the city of New York was trying to make sense of a killer who looked like a gentleman, thousands of miles away across the Atlantic Ocean, another kind of shadow was falling over the coast of Sicily. There, the killers did not care about their public image or what the newspapers said about them. They were part of a secret world where a single boat ride on a calm afternoon could end in a sudden and violent silence. We are heading to the sun-drenched docks of Porticello. On the late afternoon of July 28, 1985, Giuseppe Montana was guiding his small motorboat toward a wooden pier in the harbor of Porticello. The sun was hanging low over the Sicilian coast, turning the blue Mediterranean into a sheet of shimmering gold. He was dressed in a simple t-shirt and shorts, looking like any other man enjoying a Sunday. He worked the ropes with steady hands, feeling the pull of the warm tide against the hull of his boat. Giuseppe, whom everyone called Beppe, was a man who lived with a constant sense of awareness that most people never have to experience. He was 34 years old, athletic, and possessed a smile that could easily put a stranger at ease. He had a passion for the sea that seemed to offer him the only real peace he could find. When he was out on the water, the weight of his daily life in Palermo felt like it was miles away, buried deep under the quiet waves. Back in the city, Beppe was the head of an elite police unit known as the Catarandi, which translates to the Hunters of Fugitives. His job was to track down the highest-ranking members of the Sicilian mafia, who had disappeared into the shadows to avoid prison. He was incredibly good at it, relying on old-fashioned police work and a network of informants. He knew the faces of every major boss and the layout of every back alley in the city of Palermo. The early 1980s in Sicily were defined by what historians now call the Great Mafia War. It was a time when bodies were found in the streets almost every single day as different factions fought for control of the heroin trade. Beppe was right in the middle of this chaos, working long hours in a cramped office filled with cigarette smoke and surveillance photos. He lived with the knowledge that his name was on a list of targets held by the most dangerous men in Italy. Despite the constant threat, Beppe refused to live his life in fear or hide behind the tinted glass of an armored car. He often walked the streets of Palermo alone, stopping to buy a newspaper or have a coffee at a local stand. He believed that if the police acted like they were under siege, then the criminals had already won. He wanted the people of Sicily to see that a man could stand up to the bosses and still live a normal, dignified life in the open air. On this particular Sunday, Beppe was with his girlfriend, Assunta. They had spent the day away from the noise of the city, breathing in the salt air and watching the horizon. Assunta watched him as he secured the boat to the pier, admiring the way he seemed to shed the stress of his job as soon as he stepped onto the deck. It was a rare moment of complete normalcy for a couple whose lives were usually dictated by radio calls and the constant need for security. Porticello was a small fishing village where the rhythm of life was slow and predictable. Men sat in front of cafes repairing nets, and children played near the water's edge. It was the kind of place where a stranger stood out immediately, yet on this afternoon, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The smell of grilled fish drifted from the nearby restaurants, and the only sound was the gentle lapping of the water against the wooden pilings of the dock. As Beppe stepped off the boat and reached out a hand to help Assunta onto the pier, a small motorcycle hummed in the distance. It moved slowly through the narrow street that led down to the water, weaving around a few parked cars. There were two men on the bike, both wearing helmets, which was not unusual for riders in the area. They didn't seem to be in a hurry, blending into the lazy atmosphere of a summer evening as they approached the harbor entrance. The motorcycle came to a smooth stop just a few yards away from where Beppe was standing. The man on the back of the bike hopped off while the engine was still idling. He didn't say a word as he reached into his jacket and pulled out a .38 caliber pistol. The movement was fast and practiced, the kind of motion that comes from someone who has done this many times before. Beppe looked up just as the man raised the weapon, his eyes meeting the dark visor of the helmet. The sound of the first shot was sharp and metallic, echoing off the stone walls of the nearby buildings. It was followed by two more in quick succession. Beppe collapsed onto the wooden planks of the pier before he could even reach for his own weapon. Assunta screamed as she saw him fall, the sound tearing through the quiet afternoon. The gunman did not hesitate. He stepped closer and fired one final shot to ensure his task was complete before turning back toward the bike. The shooter climbed onto the back of the motorcycle, and the driver twisted the throttle, the engine roaring as they sped away. They disappeared into the labyrinth of streets in Porticello, leaving behind a cloud of exhaust and a stunned silence. For a few seconds, no one moved. The fishermen dropped their nets, and the children stopped playing. Everyone looked toward the pier, where the man in the simple summer clothes was lying motionless on the sun-bleached wood. Assunta knelt beside Beppe, her hands trembling as she tried to find a pulse. The blue water of the Mediterranean continued to lap gently against the boat he had just docked, a stark contrast to the red staining the pier. People began to run toward them, their faces filled with a mixture of horror and a very specific kind of knowing. In Sicily, everyone understood what had just happened. A message had been sent, and the messenger had already vanished into the hills. News of the assassination reached the police headquarters in Palermo within the hour. The office that Beppe had left just a few days ago was suddenly filled with a heavy, suffocating grief. His colleagues, men who had spent years hunting the mafia alongside him, stood in stunned silence. They knew that Beppe was more than just a talented detective. He was the moral compass of their unit. Without him, the halls of the station felt colder and much more dangerous. The investigation into the murder began immediately, but the detectives knew they were facing a wall of silence. In Porticello, the people who had seen the motorcycle were suddenly unable to remember the color of the bike or the height of the men. This was omertà, the code of silence that the mafia used to protect itself. Even those who hated the criminals were often too terrified to speak, knowing that a single word to the police could result in their own names being added to the list. Despite the silence, the police were able to piece together the logistics of the hit. It was clear that Beppe had been followed for days, his routine carefully studied. The killers knew exactly when he would be most vulnerable, catching him at the moment he was most relaxed. The choice of Porticello was also deliberate. It was a quiet place where the sound of gunfire would be a shock, a reminder that the reach of the bosses extended far beyond the city limits of Palermo. A few days after the murder, Beppe's close friend and colleague, Nini Cassara, stood before a group of reporters. He looked exhausted, his eyes red from lack of sleep. He spoke about Beppe's bravery and his dedication to the people of Sicily, but there was a chilling edge to his voice. He knew that the men who killed Beppe were likely watching the broadcast, laughing at the pain they had caused. He vowed that the work of the Caterandi would continue, no matter the cost. The cost became apparent only 9 days later. Nini Cassara was returning home to his apartment when a group of men armed with Kalashnikovs opened fire from a nearby window. He was killed instantly in front of his wife and daughter. The double blow of losing both Beppe and Nini in less than 2 weeks sent a shockwave through the entire country of Italy. It felt as though the state was losing the war, and the mafia was truly untouchable. However, the killers had underestimated the reaction of the public. Instead of retreating in fear, the people of Palermo began to take to the streets. Bedsheets with anti-mafia slogans were hung from balconies, and thousands of people attended the funerals of the fallen officers. The silence that had protected the bosses for so long was finally starting to crack. The deaths of Beppe Montana and Nini Cassara became the spark that ignited a massive social and legal revolution. The pressure from the public forced the government to provide more resources to the investigators. This led to the famous Maxi trial, where hundreds of mafia members were brought to justice in a specially built bunker courtroom. For the first time, the internal structure of the Cosa Nostra was laid bare for the world to see. Many of the men who had ordered the hits on the police officers were sentenced to life in prison, marking a major turning point in the struggle for the soul of Italy. It is a sobering thought to realize that some men have to die so that an entire nation can finally find its voice. Beppe Montana knew the risks of his job better than anyone, yet he chose to walk the streets and sail the seas without a guard. He understood that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision that something else is more important. His decision to be a citizen first and a policeman second is what ultimately made him a target, but it also made him a legend. In the decades since that afternoon in 1985, Italy has undergone a profound transformation. The laws that were passed in the wake of the assassinations are now the foundation of modern anti-mafia efforts across the globe. The Catarandi unit still exists, and they continue to hunt fugitives with the same determination that Beppe once showed. The harbor of Porticello is still quiet, but there is a small plaque near the pier that bears his name, keeping his memory alive. Looking across the sun-drenched harbor of Porticello in 2026, the legacy of Giuseppe Montana remains a central part of the curriculum for new police recruits in Italy. His life is studied not just for his tactical success, but for his integrity. Most of the men involved in his murder have either died in high-security prison cells or remain behind bars, stripped of the power they once used so cruelly. The city of Palermo is no longer the battlefield it was in the 80s, though the shadows are never entirely gone. The Mediterranean sun still sets over the coast of Sicily, and the boats still dock in the harbor of Porticello every Sunday evening. The water is calm, and the air is filled with the scent of the sea, just as it was 40 years ago. Beppe Montana's story is a reminder that even in the darkest times, a single person's commitment to the truth can ripple outward and change the world. It is a story of a man who loved the water and who gave everything to keep it clean. While the struggle for justice was unfolding under the hot sun of Sicily, a very different kind of tension was building in the cold, gray suburbs of West Germany. There, the enemy did not operate from the docks or the back alleys, but from the quiet world of high-stakes industry and government contracts. Security was not just a precaution in those neighborhoods, it was a way of life. But as one powerful man was about to find out, even the thickest walls cannot keep out a determined enough visitor. The house in Göttingen was a picture of modern German efficiency, surrounded by manicured lawns and high fences. Inside, the morning routine was as precise as a clock, with every minute accounted for before the workday began. The man who lived there was one of the most important figures in the nation's defense industry, a person whose decisions impacted the security of millions. He felt safe in his routine, protected by his status and the quiet nature of his wealthy community. That safety was shattered by the simple sound of a doorbell ringing at an hour when no guests were expected. It was a sound that should have been harmless, a sign of a routine delivery or a neighbor stopping by. But in the winter of 1985, a knock on the door could be the start of a nightmare that no amount of money or influence could stop. We are moving from the salt air of the Mediterranean to the sterile, quiet streets of a town near Munich. On the morning of February 1st, 1985, at exactly 7:15, Ernst Zimmermann was sitting at a heavy oak table in his dining room in Göttingen. The house was filled with the soft, warm light of a German winter morning. He was slowly turning the pages of a newspaper, sipping from a porcelain cup of black coffee. Outside, the world was frozen and gray, but inside the luxury villa, everything was quiet, orderly, and seemingly safe. Ernst was 55 years old and stood at the very top of the West German industrial ladder. As the chairman of MTU, he oversaw the production of massive engines for commercial aircraft and heavy battle tanks. He was a man who preferred the quiet discipline of the suburbs to the flash of the city. He was known for his sharp mind and a steady hand in business, qualities that had earned him the respect of the most powerful people in Europe. The villa in Göttingen was more than just a home. It was a fortress of modern security. Like many high-ranking executives during the Cold War, Ernst lived with the constant knowledge that he was a potential target for political extremists. His house was equipped with reinforced doors, sophisticated alarm systems, and high fences designed to keep the world at a distance. He felt secure in this sanctuary, trusting in the layers of technology that surrounded his daily life. Security protocols were a part of his everyday existence, as routine as his morning coffee. He rarely went anywhere without a detailed plan, and his movements were often monitored by a private security firm. However, inside the walls of his home, he allowed himself a small measure of relaxation. He believed that once the heavy gates were locked for the night, the dangers of the outside world were effectively neutralized. It was a comfort that many in his position relied on. At 7:20, the sharp, persistent sound of the doorbell echoed through the quiet hallway. Ernst looked up from his newspaper, his brow furrowing in slight confusion. He was not expecting any visitors or deliveries at such an early hour. His wife, Erica, was also awake and moving through the kitchen, preparing for the day ahead. They shared a brief, silent look of curiosity before Erica walked toward the front door to see who was calling so early in the morning. Through the intercom system, a polite and calm female voice explained that she was a courier with an urgent letter. She claimed the document required a personal signature from Herr Zimmermann himself before it could be released. Looking at the video monitor, Erica saw a young woman dressed in a standard professional uniform, holding a small cardboard envelope. It was a scene so common and unremarkable that it didn't trigger any immediate sense of alarm or danger. You are standing in the hallway, watching as Erica reaches for the heavy deadbolt of the front door. You hear the rhythmic clacking of the security locks being disengaged, a sound that usually signals a welcome guest or a simple chore. The door swings open just a few inches, allowing the cold winter air to rush into the warm house. For a split second, the interaction seems entirely normal, just another professional transaction in a life filled with them. But as the door opened fully, the polite facade of the courier vanished instantly. A young man who had been crouching out of sight of the camera suddenly lunged forward, pushing his way into the house. He was moving with a terrifying practiced speed that caught Erica completely off guard. Before she could scream or reach for the alarm, she found herself staring into the dark barrel of a submachine gun. The quiet of the morning was shattered by the sound of heavy boots on the floor. The two intruders moved through the house with military precision, showing no signs of hesitation or confusion. They didn't shout or make demands for money or jewelry. Instead, they focused entirely on controlling the space and the people inside it. They were cold, quiet, and highly disciplined, behaving more like elite soldiers than common criminals. They moved directly toward the dining room, as if they already knew exactly where Ernst would be sitting. Ernst stood up as the two strangers entered the room, his newspaper fluttering to the floor like a wounded bird. He looked at the weapons in their hands, and then at his wife, who was being held firmly by the young woman. He was a man used to being in control of every situation, but in this moment, he realized he was completely powerless. These were not people who could be reasoned with or bought off with a check. They were here for something much more permanent. The intruders were members of the Red Army faction, a group of urban guerrillas who had been terrorizing West Germany for over a decade. While the first generation of the group had been loud and flamboyant, this third generation was different. They were invisible, working in small cells and maintaining perfectly ordinary lives in between their strikes. They viewed men like Ernst as symbols of a military-industrial complex that they were determined to destroy with violence. The young man forced Ernst and Erica to sit on the floor in the center of the dining room. He worked quickly, using plastic zip ties to bind Erica's hands behind her back. He didn't look her in the eye or say a word as he tightened the restraints. Ernst watched his wife, his face pale but his expression remarkably calm. He tried to speak, perhaps to ask them to let her go, but the man simply nudged him with the barrel of the gun, signaling for absolute silence. The only sound in the villa was the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway and the distant, muffled sound of a car driving by on the street. The smell of the morning coffee was still in the air, a bitter contrast to the atmosphere of impending doom in the room. Erica could feel the cold hardwood floor against her knees and the sharp bite of the plastic ties around her wrists. She looked at the intruders, searching for a spark of human emotion. After ensuring that the house was empty of any other occupants, the woman gave a short, sharp nod to her partner. The man grabbed Ernst by the shoulder and forced him to his feet. He began to lead him away from the dining room, and toward a small guest bedroom at the back of the house. Erica tried to move toward them, but the woman held her down, her grip like iron. The door to the guest room closed, leaving Erica alone with the sound of her own breathing. Inside the guest room, the man forced Ernst to lie face down on the bed. There was no long-winded speech about politics or revolution. There was no hesitation in the killer's movements. He pulled a silenced pistol from his waistband, a weapon designed for stealth and close-quarters work. He placed the cold metal of the barrel against the back of Ernst's head. Two soft, muffled thuds followed, sounds that were barely audible through the thick walls of the villa. The man walked back into the dining room a few moments later, his face as expressionless as a stone mask. He tucked the pistol away and looked at the woman, who was still guarding Erica. Without a word, the two of them turned and walked toward the front door. They didn't take a single item from the house, no cash, no documents, no electronics. They stepped out into the biting winter air and disappeared into the gray fog of the Göttingen suburbs. Erica remained on the floor for what felt like an eternity, her mind refusing to process the silence coming from the guest room. She struggled against the plastic ties, her skin raw and bleeding, until she finally managed to loosen them enough to reach a telephone. Her voice was a ragged whisper as she called the local police, trying to explain that the fortress had been breached. By the time the first sirens were heard in the distance, the killers were miles away. When the investigators arrived, they were struck by the sterile nature of the crime scene. There were no signs of a struggle in the dining room, and the breakfast table looked like it belonged in a furniture catalog. It was only when they entered the guest room that they found the reality of the morning. Ernst Zimmermann, one of the most powerful men in the country, had been executed with a level of cold efficiency that horrified even the most veteran detectives. The manhunt that followed was the largest and most intense in the history of the West German police force. They set up roadblocks across the state and analyzed every second of the intercom footage. They searched for the courier and her partner in every radical enclave in Europe. But the killers had vanished completely. They had left no fingerprints, no hair samples, and no witnesses other than a traumatized woman who could only describe two very ordinary faces. This was the terrifying power of the RAF's third generation. They were the invisible enemy, people who could be your neighbor or your coworker until the moment they were called to act. They didn't leave manifestos at the scene or engage in the dramatic courtroom theater of their predecessors. They worked in the shadows, striking with absolute precision and then retreating back into the safety of the mundane. They were ghosts with submachine guns. The assassinations of Ernst Zimmermann sent a shockwave through the upper echelons of European society. It proved that no amount of technology or security could truly protect a person if the attackers were willing to wait for a moment of human routine. The fortress of the home had been exposed as a fragile illusion. In the months that followed, high-ranking executives across the continent began to live like fugitives, constantly changing their habits. Despite the intensity of the investigation, the case eventually went cold. Several names were floated by intelligence agencies as potential shooters, but there was never enough physical evidence to bring anyone to trial. The shooters remained unidentified for years, their identities buried deep within the secret files of the RAF. The lack of closure was a second wound for the family, a reminder that the people who had destroyed their lives were still out there. It is a chilling realization that the most dangerous door in a person's life is often their own front door. We build our lives around the idea of safety, convinced that our walls and our locks will keep the darkness at bay. But Ernst Zimmermann did everything right according to the rules of his world, and it wasn't enough. He was undone by the simple, polite request of a woman with a letter, a moment of normal human interaction that turned out to be a death sentence. The Red Army faction officially announced their dissolution in 1998, claiming that the world had changed and their struggle was no longer necessary. They left behind a trail of blood and unanswered questions that still haunt the German legal system today. Many of the families of their victims, including the Zimmermanns, were left to process their grief in a world that had moved on to new types of threats and new types of terror. In the decades since that February morning, forensic science has advanced in ways that the investigators in 1985 could only dream of. DNA samples recovered from the villa have been retested multiple times against international databases. While there have been occasional leads, the specific individuals who entered the Zimmermann home have never been definitively caught and convicted for this specific crime. They remain shadows in the history of the Cold War. 41 years after that winter morning, the case files in Gauting remain open in 2026. The German authorities still maintain an open file on the assassination of Ernst Zimmermann. Modern digital forensics and facial recognition software are periodically applied to the old evidence, but the trail is now more than 40 years old. The villa in Gauting has been sold and renovated several times, its new owners likely unaware of the history that unfolded in the dining room and the quiet guest bedroom at the back. The memory of Ernst Zimmermann is now a part of the study of political terrorism, a case study in the vulnerability of high-value targets. His death marked the peak of a specific kind of urban warfare that defined an era of European history. It is a story about the intersection of power, routine, and the sudden, violent arrival of the unexpected. The silence of that winter morning in Gauting still echoes for those who understand what was truly lost that day. The cold, mechanical execution of an industrialist in a quiet suburb was a message designed to strike fear into the heart of a nation's elite. But as we move from the gray, winter streets of Germany to the humid, sun-drenched avenues of San Salvador, we find a different kind of violence. There, the goal wasn't just to target one powerful man in a private room, but to tear through a crowded street filled with people just looking for a night of music and dinner. In the mid-1980s, San Salvador was a city divided by a brutal civil war, yet life in certain districts continued with a strange, forced normalcy. The Zona Rosa was a place of neon lights and outdoor cafes, where the sound of the war felt like a distant rumor. People went there to escape the tension of the day, sitting at tables under the stars and ordering drinks while the humid breeze blew through the trees. It was a place for young people. Among the crowd on one June evening were 4 young men who were thousands of miles from home. They were off-duty Marines, enjoying a rare night of freedom in a country that felt increasingly hostile. They were dressed in plain clothes, laughing and talking over a meal, unaware that the shadows around them were moving. The transition from a social dinner to a scene of absolute carnage would happen in the time it takes to pull a trigger. On the evening of June 19, 1985, the humid air of San Salvador was filled with the sound of upbeat music and social chatter. In the upscale district known as the Zona Rosa, the neon lights of the cafes flickered against the darkening sky like artificial stars. People were dressed in their best clothes, looking to escape the heavy tension of the civil war that had gripped the country for years. It felt like a small, safe island in a very rough sea. Bobby Dixon was 27 years old and was one of 4 United States Marines stationed at the embassy nearby. He was a man who took his duties seriously, but also knew how to appreciate a rare night of leave with his friends. He had a way of making his fellow Marines laugh, even when the situation in the country was tense and unpredictable. To Bobby, this night was about more than just a meal. It was about feeling like a normal young man again for a few hours. His friends, Thomas Handwerk, Patrick Kwiatkowski, and Gregory Weber, were all in their early 20s. They were thousands of miles from the quiet American suburbs where they grew up, now serving in a place where the rules of safety changed every day. Despite the risks, they were in high spirits as they walked down the main avenue of the Zona Rosa. They were dressed in plain clothes, polo shirts, and slacks to avoid drawing any unnecessary attention to their military status. The 4 men chose a table at the Mediterranean Cafe, a popular outdoor spot with white umbrellas and a view of the passing crowd. The smell of grilled meats and cold beer drifted through the air, and the sound of a live band played somewhere down the street. It was the kind of environment where you could almost forget that soldiers were patrolling the city limits. They sat down, ordered their drinks, and began to talk about their plans for when they finally went back home. You are sitting at a small table just a few feet away from the Marines, enjoying the cool condensation on your glass. The evening breeze is carrying the scent of blooming jasmine from the nearby gardens, and the atmosphere is relaxed and festive. You watch the 4 young Americans laughing together, their short haircuts the only real clue to their profession. It is a moment of pure, ordinary life, the kind of scene that happens in cities all over the world every single night. The cafe was nearly full, with local businessmen and families taking advantage of the pleasant weather. Waiters moved quickly between the tables, carrying heavy trays of food and shouting orders back to the kitchen. There was a sense of shared community in the district, a collective agreement to ignore the darkness of the war just for a little while. The Marines were blending in perfectly, their presence a symbol of the close relationship between their government and the locals. As the clock neared 9:30, a white pickup truck slowed down as it approached the entrance of the Mediterranean Cafe. It didn't seem out of place in the busy traffic of the Zona Rosa, where cars were constantly dropping people off and picking them up. A few men jumped out of the back of the truck, dressed in what appeared to be standard military camouflage uniforms. To most onlookers, they looked like just another patrol of government soldiers keeping the peace. The men in camouflage moved with a sudden, sharp intensity that didn't match the casual pace of the street. They fanned out across the sidewalk, their boots clicking loudly on the pavement as they approached the outdoor seating area. They were carrying automatic rifles, held at the ready, which caused a few diners to look up from their plates in curiosity. There was no immediate panic because the sight of armed men in San Salvador was unfortunately common at that time. The first sign that something was wrong was the silence that followed the arrival of the men in uniforms. The live music seemed to fade into the background as the men took up positions around the perimeter of the cafe. They weren't looking at the crowd in general. Their eyes were fixed on the specific table where the four Marines were sitting. The young Americans had just received their appetizers and were reaching for their drinks when the lead gunman stepped forward. The transition from a peaceful dinner to a scene of absolute chaos happened in less than a second. The men in camouflage opened fire simultaneously, the rhythmic thumping of the automatic weapons drowning out every other sound in the district. They weren't firing warning shots into the air or making demands. They were firing directly into the seating area with a cold, mechanical precision. The white umbrellas of the cafe were instantly shredded by the hail of high-velocity bullets. The four Marines didn't even have time to stand up or dive for cover. They were hit where they sat, the force of the rounds knocking them backward out of their chairs. The people at the surrounding tables scrambled in every direction, tripping over furniture and each other in a desperate attempt to escape the line of fire. Screams filled the air, but they were mostly muffled by the continuous roar of the rifles. It was a concentrated burst of violence that felt like an eternity. When the gunmen stopped firing, the silence that returned to the Zona Rosa was heavier than anything that had come before. The men in camouflage didn't linger to check their work. They turned and ran back toward the white pickup truck, which was already starting to move. They disappeared into the night, leaving behind a scene that looked like a war zone. The smell of gunpowder and scorched pavement replaced the pleasant scent of the evening meal in an instant. The first people to reach the Mediterranean Cafe found a scene of total devastation. 13 people were lying on the ground, including the 4 U.S. Marines and 2 American businessmen who had been sitting nearby. 7 Salvadoran civilians, including a waiter and several bystanders, had also been caught in the crossfire. The brightly colored drinks and plates of food were scattered across the floor, mixed with shattered glass and the dark stains of the evening's tragedy. The investigation into the Zona Rosa attack was immediate and massive, involving both local authorities and the FBI. It didn't take long for a group known as the PRTC, a radical urban front of the FMLN guerrillas, to claim responsibility for the massacre. They stated that the attack was a deliberate strike against Yankee imperialism and was intended to show that no one was safe as long as the United States continued to support the Salvadoran government. The killers had chosen the Zona Rosa specifically because of its reputation as a safe zone for foreigners and the local elite. By turning a place of leisure into a site of slaughter, they hoped to shatter the public's confidence and force a change in the political landscape. The fact that the attackers had worn military uniforms was a calculated move to cause confusion and fear, making it impossible for citizens to know who to trust when they saw a man with a gun. In the weeks following the attack, the United States government vowed to bring the perpetrators to justice. President Reagan addressed the nation, calling the Marines heroes of peace and promising that the killers would find no place to hide. The FBI worked closely with Salvadoran intelligence to track the movement of the white pickup truck and identify the specific cell responsible for the planning. It was one of the most complex international investigations of the decade. The detectives eventually focused on a man named Ismael Dimas Aguilar, who was believed to be the mastermind behind the urban guerrilla cell. Through a series of informants and recovered documents, they were able to reconstruct the months of planning that went into the few seconds of the attack. The guerrillas had spent weeks watching the Mediterranean Cafe, noting when the Marines arrived and where they preferred to sit. It was a cold, surgical operation from the start. By the late 1980s, Several members of the PRTC were captured and brought to trial for the murders. The legal proceedings were a grim reminder of the cost of the conflict, with witnesses describing the horror of the night in vivid detail. Some of the men involved were sentenced to long prison terms, while others disappeared into the chaos of the ongoing war, their fates unknown. The attack remained a deep scar on the relationship between the two nations. There is a particular kind of cruelty in a crime that targets people during a moment of genuine happiness. The four Marines weren't on a battlefield, they were sharing a meal and talking about their futures. The killers didn't see them as individuals with families and dreams, but as symbols that needed to be erased to send a message. This detachment from human life is what allowed them to fire into a crowded cafe full of innocent bystanders without hesitation. The Zona Rosa massacre served as a turning point in the Salvadoran Civil War, leading to an increase in U.S. military aid and a more aggressive stance against the urban guerrilla fronts. It also changed the way Americans viewed the risks of serving in Central America. The image of the empty chairs and the shredded white umbrellas at the Mediterranean Cafe became a symbol of a decade where the lines between peace and war were often blurred beyond recognition. The Civil War in El Salvador officially ended in 1992 with the signing of the peace accords. The FMLN transitioned from a guerrilla organization into a legitimate political party, and many of the former combatants were integrated back into society. However, for the families of the 13 people killed in the Zona Rosa, the peace came too late. The memory of that June night remained a private weight that they would carry for the rest of their lives. In the years following the peace, the district of Zona Rosa was rebuilt, and once again became a center of nightlife and commerce in San Salvador. New cafes and restaurants opened their doors, and the neon lights returned to the avenues. Most of the people walking the streets today are too young to remember the sound of the automatic rifles or the sight of the white pickup truck. The city has moved on, but the ground still holds the history of what happened there. In the vibrant, neon-lit avenues of today's San Salvador, the 2026 landscape shows a city reclaimed by a new era of absolute security under a government focused on total public safety. The districts that were once the sites of guerrilla warfare and gang violence are now more heavily policed than ever before. The Mediterranean Cafe is long gone, replaced by modern developments that reflect a country trying to leave its dark history behind. Yet, the name Zona Rosa still carries a specific echo for the older generation. The Marines who died that night are remembered with a memorial plaque at the U.S. Embassy in San Salvador, a quiet tribute to four young men who were just looking for a good meal. Their stories are a reminder of the fragility of the peace we often take for granted. Every year on the anniversary of the attack, a few people still gather to leave flowers near the spot where the tables once stood, ensuring that the names of the victims are not entirely lost to time. It is a strange feeling to walk through a place of beauty and realize that it was once a place of such profound ugliness. We often look for monsters in the dark, but the story of the Zona Rosa proves that they are just as likely to appear in the bright lights of a crowded street. The transition from a night of laughter to a night of mourning can happen in a single heartbeat, leaving behind a silence that no amount of time or progress can ever truly fill. The calculated violence of a guerrilla cell in El Salvador was a shock to the world, but it was driven by a clear, if brutal, political logic. However, as we move from the humid streets of San Salvador to the sun-drenched offices of a newspaper in Athens, Greece, we find a different kind of shadow. There, the target wasn't a group of foreign soldiers, but a single man who used his pen to challenge the powerful. He was a man who believed that the truth was worth the risk. Georgos Athanasiadis was a man of words, and in the Greece of the early 1980s, words could be very dangerous things. He spent his days in a room filled with the smell of ink and the sound of printing presses, overseeing a publication that refused to stay silent. He was a man who understood the weight of his responsibility, but he didn't realize that his commitment to his craft had made him the primary target of a group that lived in the dark. The office of the newspaper was a place of constant activity, with journalists rushing to meet deadlines and the phones ringing off the hook. It felt like the heart of the city, a place where the pulse of the nation could be felt in every headline. But as the sun began to set on a quiet evening in 1983, a visitor was approaching the building who had no interest in the news. He was carrying a weapon that had already been used to change the course of history. On the evening of March 19th, 1983, the streets of Athens were bathed in the soft glow of streetlights and the neon signs of late-night cafes. Inside the offices of the Vratini newspaper, the air was thick with the scent of fresh ink and the rhythmic clacking of manual typewriters. Georgos Athanasiadis sat in his private office on the second floor, leaning over a stack of final proofs. He was 71 years old, but his eyes were sharp and focused as he looked for any errors before the morning edition went to the presses. Georgos was a man who lived for the news. He had spent his entire life in the world of journalism, working his way up from a cub reporter to become the editor-in-chief of one of the most respected conservative newspapers in Greece. He was a man of habit, known for being the first person to arrive in the morning and the last one to leave at night. To his staff, he was a steady and calm presence who treated every headline with the same level of professional gravity, no matter how controversial the topic might be. His office was a reflection of his long career. The walls were lined with framed front pages of historic events he had covered, and his desk was almost completely hidden under piles of manuscripts and reference books. He had a small radio that played classical music softly in the background, a small comfort during the long hours of the evening shift. Despite his age, he felt a deep sense of purpose in his work, believing that a free press was the only thing standing between the public and the chaos of political corruption. Outside his door, the newsroom was beginning to quiet down as the journalists finished their assignments. The few staff members who remained were focused on their own tasks, barely looking up as the occasional visitor walked through the main lobby. It was a time of day when the office felt more like a library than a busy media hub. Georgos enjoyed these final quiet moments, the time when he could truly think about the stories that would shape the national conversation the following day. At exactly 8 o'clock, a man walked into the building and approached the reception desk. He was wearing a beige trench coat and a hat that partially shaded his face from the overhead lights. He looked like a professional, perhaps a lawyer or a government official coming to deliver a late-night document. He spoke in a calm, polite tone, asking the secretary if he could speak with Herr Athanasiadis about a private matter. He didn't seem nervous or hurried, moving with a confident ease that suggested he belonged there. The secretary checked her log and saw that Georgos was indeed still in his office. She didn't think twice about the request, as it was common for the editor to meet with sources or colleagues at odd hours. She pointed toward the stairs and told the man he could go right up. The man thanked her with a slight nod and began to walk toward the second floor. His footsteps were light and rhythmic on the stairs, barely audible over the distant hum of the printing presses in the basement. Georgos did not look up immediately when he heard the soft knock on his door. He assumed it was one of his junior editors coming to ask a final question about the lead story. He muttered a quick invitation to enter while he circled a typo with his red pen. He felt the door open and heard the floorboards creak as the visitor stepped into the room. It was only when the silence lasted a few seconds too long that Georgos finally raised his head, expecting to see a familiar face from his staff. Instead, he found himself looking at a stranger standing in the middle of his office. The man in the beige coat had not said a word, and his hands were tucked deep into his pockets. For a moment, Georgos simply stared at him, his mind trying to place the man among the hundreds of people he had interviewed over the years. The classical music continued to play on the radio, filling the space between the two men with a delicate, haunting melody. There was no sign of aggression in the stranger's posture. The man slowly removed his right hand from his pocket, revealing a heavy, black .45 caliber semi-automatic pistol. The weapon looked massive in the small, cluttered office. Georgos felt a sudden, cold wave of realization wash over him, but he didn't cry out or try to dive for cover. He was a man who had seen the worst of human nature throughout his career, and he understood the finality of the situation instantly. He sat perfectly still, his red pen still gripped tightly in his hand. The shooter raised the gun and fired 3 times in rapid succession. The reports were deafening in the confined space, the sound bouncing off the walls and shattering the quiet atmosphere of the building. The bullet struck Georgos in the chest and neck, knocking him backward into his chair. The red pen flew from his hand, leaving a long, jagged streak across the page he had been editing. The smell of burnt gunpowder filled the room, mixing with the scent of the old paper and the drying ink. The man in the trench coat did not stay to watch the life fade from the editor's eyes. He lowered the weapon and tucked it back into his pocket with the same calm precision he had used to enter the building. He turned and walked out of the office, his footsteps steady as he headed back down the stairs. To the staff in the newsroom who had been startled by the noise, he looked like a man who was simply finished with his business. He walked out of the front door and disappeared into the night. The first person to reach the office found Giorgos slumped over his desk, his white hair stained a deep, dark red. The staff members stood in the doorway in a state of shock, their minds unable to reconcile the violence of the scene with the peaceful man they had known for so long. The radio was still playing, the soft music continuing as if nothing had happened. There were no signs of a struggle, and nothing had been stolen. It was an execution, plain and simple, carried out in the heart of the city. The investigation into the murder of Giorgos Athanasiadis began immediately, but the detectives were met with a frustrating lack of evidence. The secretary could only provide a vague description of a man in a beige coat, a description that could have fit thousands of people in Athens. There were no fingerprints on the door, and no one had seen a getaway car. The only real clue was the caliber of the bullets recovered from the editor's body. They were a match for a very specific and terrifying weapon. Ballistics testing soon confirmed what many in the Greek government had already feared. The .45 caliber pistol used to kill Giorgos was the same one used in several other high-profile assassinations over the past 8 years. It was the signature weapon of a group known as Revolutionary Organization 17 November, or 17N. They were a shadowy, ultra-leftist group that viewed themselves as the guardians of the people, targeting anyone they perceived as a symbol of the establishment or foreign influence. For the next several years, the 17N group became a ghost that haunted the streets of Athens. They were unlike any other terrorist organization in Europe. They didn't have a known headquarters, they didn't communicate with other groups, and they never made a mistake that led to an arrest. They were a small, tightly knit cell of individuals who lived completely ordinary lives by day and carried out surgical strikes by night. To the Greek police, they were invisible, a force of nature that could not be stopped. The group's manifestos, which were sent to local newspapers after each hit, were long, academic, and filled with a cold intellectual rage. They claimed that Giorgos Athanasiadis was a servant of the junta, and that his newspaper was a tool of American propaganda. They showed no remorse for the death of the 71-year-old man, viewing his execution as a necessary act of political cleansing. The fact that they could enter a major newspaper office and kill the editor without being caught was a humiliation for the state. In 1988, 5 years after the murder, a new breakthrough in the investigation seemed to offer hope. A witness came forward with information about a safe house that might be linked to the group. The police raided the location with a massive force, hoping to finally put an end to the reign of terror. They found maps, radical literature, and evidence of surveillance on other potential targets. But once again, the members of 17N had anticipated the move and vanished before the doors were kicked in. The frustration of the Greek authorities grew as the list of victims continued to get longer. They targeted diplomats, police officers, and businessmen, always using the same .45 caliber pistol. The gun became a symbol of their untouchability, a mechanical witness to a decade of failure by the law. Every time the police thought they were getting close, the group would go silent for months, only to reappear with another high-profile hit that proved they were still active and just as dangerous as ever. It would take nearly 20 years after the death of Giorgos Athanasiadis for the cycle of violence to finally come to an end. In the summer of 2002, a man named Savas Shiros was injured when a bomb he was carrying exploded prematurely at the port of Piraeus. The police were able to identify him, and through him, they finally found the thread that would unravel the entire organization. They discovered a secret apartment in Athens that served as the group's headquarters and the location of their legendary weapon. Inside the apartment, hidden behind a false wall, the detectives finally found the black .45 caliber pistol. It was clean, well-oiled, and looked exactly as it had in the 1980s. Along with the gun, they found the group's banners and the typewriter used to create their manifestos. The ghosts were finally given names and faces. They weren't mysterious international mercenaries. They were professors, shoemakers, and ordinary citizens who had been living among their victims for decades. The trial of the 17N members was one of the most significant legal events in Greek history. Dimitris Koufoudinas, the man identified as the group's primary triggerman, remained defiant throughout the proceedings. He admitted to his role in many of the assassinations, including the death of the editor, and refused to apologize for his actions. He viewed himself as a soldier in a war that most people didn't even realize was being fought. He was sentenced to multiple life terms in a high-security prison. The legacy of Georgos Athanasiadis is now tied to the victory of the rule of law over political violence. While he did not live to see the capture of his killers, his death became a catalyst for the modernization of the Greek counterterrorism units. The Verdini newspaper continued to publish for many years after the tragedy, a testament to the resilience of the staff who refused to be silenced by the beige coat and the .45 caliber gun. The office is gone now, but the memory of the editor remains sharp. Within the quiet, sterile walls of a Greek high-security prison in 2026, Dimitris Koufoudinas remains in prison, having served more than 20 years of his sentence. His occasional hunger strikes and legal appeals still make the news, serving as a reminder of the dark decade of the 1980s. Most of the other members of the group are also still behind bars, their influence on Greek politics now reduced to a historical footnote. The .45 caliber pistol is housed in a police museum, a cold piece of steel that no longer has the power to silence. The empty chair in the editor's office was eventually filled, but the atmosphere of the newsroom was never quite the same. The clacking of the typewriters has been replaced by the hum of computers, and the physical proofs have been replaced by digital screens. But for those who were there on that March night, the sound of the 3 shots still echoes in the quiet moments of the evening. It is a story about the weight of words and the terrible price that is sometimes paid to print them. The calculated silence of a political assassin in Athens was a terrifying thing, but it was driven by a twisted sense of ideology. However, as we leave the narrow streets of Greece behind and head toward the open waters of the Mediterranean, we find a different kind of horror. There, the violence wasn't targeted at a single powerful individual, but at an entire ship full of people who were simply trying to enjoy a holiday. On a massive cruise liner, there is nowhere to hide when the shadows decide to come on board. The Achille Lauro was a floating city of luxury, a place of grand ballrooms and sprawling decks where the only concern was the next meal or the next sunset. Among the hundreds of passengers was a man who had spent his life overcoming obstacles, a man who believed that even in a wheelchair, the world was still a place to be explored. He was looking forward to the history of the ancient ports, unaware that he was about to become a part of a much darker history himself. The ship was gliding through the calm waters off the coast of Egypt, the rhythmic vibration of the engines, a soothing background noise for the passengers as they dressed for dinner. It felt like the safest place on Earth, a world away from the political tensions of the mainland. But as the sun began to dip below the horizon, 4 young men were preparing to move through the hallways with a purpose that had nothing to do with tourism. The peace of the Mediterranean was about to be broken by a sound that no one expected. On the afternoon of October 7th, 1985, the cruise ship Achille Lauro was cutting a steady, white wake through the calm blue waters of the Mediterranean Sea. On the promenade deck, 69-year-old Leon Klinghoffer sat in his wheelchair, feeling the warm Egyptian sun on his face. He had a gentle, weathered face and eyes that had seen a lifetime of hard work in the appliance manufacturing business back in New York. Beside him, his wife Marilyn was adjusted his blanket, her movements familiar and full of a quiet, enduring affection. Leon was a man who refused to let the limitations of his body dictate the scope of his life. He had suffered 2 strokes that had left him partially paralyzed and dependent on his wheelchair, but his spirit remained as sharp as the Atlantic wind. He was a quintessential New Yorker, blunt but kind, with a deep love for his family and a sudden, booming laugh that could fill a room. This cruise was supposed to be a celebration of their 36th wedding anniversary, a hard-earned reward for decades of shared struggle and success. Marilyn was a small, resilient woman who carried her own secret burden during the trip. She was privately battling colon cancer, yet her focus remained entirely on making sure Leon enjoyed every moment of their Mediterranean holiday. They had saved for years to afford this luxury, dreaming of the ancient ports and the sprawling historical beauty of the Middle East. For the first few days of the voyage, the ship had been a floating sanctuary of fine dining, soft music, and the slow, rhythmic rocking of the waves. The Achille Lauro was a massive, 23,000-ton vessel that functioned like a small, self-contained city. It was filled with grand ballrooms, polished wood railings, and hundreds of crew members dedicated to the comfort of the passengers. Most of the tourists had gone ashore that morning at the port of Alexandria to visit the pyramids of Giza. Leon and Marilyn had decided to stay on board, preferring the quiet of the nearly empty ship to the heat and the crowds of the Egyptian mainland. You are sitting in the elegant dining room, looking out through the large glass windows at the flat, sparkling horizon. The only sound is the soft clinking of silverware and the low hum of the ship's air conditioning system. The waiter brings a fresh bottle of wine to your table, his movements professional and calm. It feels like a moment of perfect, unassailable safety. The kind of afternoon where the outside world and its complicated politics simply cease to exist. But then, the heavy double doors of the kitchen swing open with a violent crash. Earlier that morning, a steward had walked into a cabin on a lower deck to perform a routine cleaning. He expected to find a messy bed and empty suitcases. Instead, he found 4 young men gathered around a table, meticulously cleaning AK-47 rifles and stacking hand grenades. The young men were members of the Palestine Liberation Front, and they had smuggled the weapons onto the ship in Genoa. They had originally planned to launch an attack when the ship reached Israel, but their discovery by the steward forced them to move ahead of schedule. The hijackers moved through the ship with a frenetic, disorganized energy. They fired bursts of automatic fire into the ceilings of the lounges, the hot brass shell casings bouncing off the expensive carpets. They quickly seized control of the bridge, placing a gun to the head of the captain, Gerardo de Rosa. They ordered him to steer the ship away from the Egyptian coast and into the open sea. The luxury liner, once a symbol of leisure, was suddenly transformed into a massive, steel prison for the 400 souls remaining on board. Leon and Marilyn were gathered with the rest of the passengers in the main lounge. The air in the room was thick with heat and the smell of fear. The hijackers were young, nervous, and seemingly prone to sudden outbursts of temper. They began to divide the passengers based on their nationalities, shouting orders in broken English and Arabic. They were looking for specific targets to use as leverage for their demands. They wanted the release of 50 Palestinian prisoners held in Israeli jails, and they wanted it done within the next 24 hours. The hijackers eventually singled out a group of 12 Americans and 6 British passengers. They forced this smaller group out of the air-conditioned lounge and up to the exposed aft deck. The sun was beating down on the steel floor, and there was no shade to be found. Leon was among them, his wheelchair being pushed roughly across the deck by one of the gunmen. He sat in the middle of the group, his face set in a grim mask of defiance, his hand holding tightly onto Marilyn's as the hijackers began to pace around them. The lead hijacker was a man named Magid al-Mulki. He was cold and disciplined, showing none of the jittery anxiety of his younger subordinates. He spent the night radioing the Egyptian and Syrian authorities, issuing threats and demanding that his terms be met immediately. But as the hours dragged on, the governments refused to negotiate. The hijackers began to realize that they were being ignored by the world. Al-Mulchi's frustration began to turn into a calculated, lethal rage as the deadline he had set approached. The atmosphere on the deck was one of absolute exhaustion and terror. The hostages were forced to sit on the hot deck for hours without food or water. The gunmen would occasionally fire shots over their heads or scream at them to keep their heads down. Leon remained remarkably calm, whispering words of encouragement to Marilyn despite the pain in his paralyzed limbs. He didn't beg for mercy or show the gunmen the fear they were clearly looking for. He simply sat there, a 69-year-old man in a wheelchair, refusing to be broken. On the morning of October 8th, al-Mulki decided that a demonstration was necessary. He walked over to the group of Americans and stared at them for a long time. He wasn't looking for a soldier or a young man who might fight back. He was looking for someone whose death would carry the most symbolic weight. He looked at Leon Klinghoffer, sitting helplessly in his wheelchair, and signaled to 2 of his men. They grabbed the handles of the chair and began to push Leon toward the edge of the deck, away from the other hostages. Marilyn tried to follow, but a hijacker shoved her back to the ground with the butt of his rifle. She watched, powerless, as her husband was taken around a corner of the superstructure. Leon did not cry out. He looked back at her one last time, his expression one of quiet resignation. Al-Mulchi led him to a secluded spot near the railing. The only sounds were the wind whistling through the ship's rigging and the distant throb of the engines. The hijacker spoke a few words in Arabic that Leon could not understand, and then he raised his pistol. The gunman fired one shot into Leon's forehead and a second shot into his chest. Leon died instantly, his body slumping forward in the chair. Al-Mulki then turned to two members of the ship's crew who had been forced to watch the execution. He ordered them to pick up the wheelchair and throw it over the side of the ship. The crewmen, weeping and trembling, lifted the heavy chair and its occupant over the railing. Leon Klinghoffer disappeared into the dark, churning wake of the Achille Lauro, followed by the chair he had used to navigate the world. Al-Mulchi walked back to the bridge and informed Captain De Rosa that he had killed a passenger. He told the captain that he would kill another every 15 minutes until his demands were met. He even went so far as to force the captain to tell the authorities over the radio that everyone is fine, while the blood of Leon Klinghoffer was still wet on the deck. The level of cold-blooded deception was staggering. The hijackers then forced the rest of the hostages back inside, leaving the deck empty except for a few spent shell casings. The standoff lasted for another 24 hours before the hijackers struck a deal with the Egyptian government. They were promised safe passage to Tunisia in exchange for the release of the ship and the remaining hostages. The hijackers surrendered their weapons and were taken to an Egyptian airbase, where they were put on a commercial flight. They believed they had won, leaving the Achille Lauro behind as it limped back toward port. But the news of Leon's murder had already reached the highest levels of the United States government. President Ronald Reagan was outraged by the killing of a disabled American citizen. He authorized a daring military operation to intercept the plane carrying the hijackers. 414 Tomcat fighter jets from the USS Saratoga launched into the night, tracking the Egyptian airliner over the Mediterranean. They surrounded the plane in total darkness and forced it to land at a NATO base in Sigonella, Italy. The hijackers were stunned as they stepped off the plane and found themselves surrounded by elite American and Italian soldiers. A long and complicated legal battle followed between the United States and Italy over who had jurisdiction to try the terrorists. The Italian government eventually took custody of the men, but they allowed the mastermind behind the operation, Abu Abbas, to escape to Yugoslavia. This caused a major diplomatic crisis known as the Sigonella Incident. However, the 4 actual hijackers were eventually tried and convicted in an Italian court. Magid al-Mulchi, the man who pulled the trigger, was sentenced to 30 years in prison. The body of Leon Klinghoffer was discovered a few days later, washed up on the coast of Syria. He was still wearing his holiday clothes. The forensic examination confirmed the brutal nature of his execution, providing the final piece of evidence needed to secure the convictions of his killers. Leon was returned to New York and buried in a quiet ceremony. His family established a foundation in his name to fight against the kind of hatred and terrorism that had taken his life on what was supposed to be a celebratory voyage. It is a profound tragedy when a man survives 2 strokes and a lifetime of labor only to be murdered for the sake of a political statement. Leon Klinghoffer was not a combatant in any war. He was a tourist in a wheelchair who loved his wife. The hijackers didn't see his humanity. They only saw his nationality and his religion. Their act of cowardice didn't help their cause. It only served to unite the world in condemnation of their cruelty. The silence of the Mediterranean that day was a witness to a debt that could never be repaid. Marilyn Klinghoffer passed away just 4 months after the hijacking, her battle with cancer finally coming to an end. Her family believed she died of a broken heart as much as the disease. She had spent her final weeks ensuring that the truth about what happened on the ship was known to everyone. She and Leon had been inseparable for 36 years, and in the end, the violence of the world could only keep them apart for a very short time. They were buried side by side, finally at peace. Magid al-Mulchi served nearly 24 years of his sentence before being released on parole for good behavior in 2009. He disappeared into the shadows of the Middle East, and his current whereabouts are unknown. Abu Abbas, the mastermind, was eventually captured by U.S. Special Forces during the invasion of Iraq in 2003. He died in American custody a year later of natural causes. The justice for Leon Klinghoffer was slow, messy, and incomplete, reflecting the complicated world in which he lived. The Achille Lauro itself met a dramatic end in 1994. While sailing off the coast of Somalia, a fire broke out in the engine room and quickly spread through the ship. The luxury liner that had been the site of such a historic crime eventually listed to one side and sank into the deep waters of the Indian Ocean. As of early 2026, the wreck lies thousands of feet below the surface, a rusting monument to an era of piracy and political violence that has since evolved into even darker forms. Every year, the daughters of Leon and Marilyn Klinghoffer hold a small private memorial to honor their parents. They speak of Leon's laugh and Marilyn's strength, refusing to let the memory of the hijacking define the entirety of their lives. The story of the Achille Lauro remains a staple of counterterrorism studies, a case study in how the innocent are often the first to pay the price for the grievances of the world. It serves as a reminder that the ocean, for all its beauty, can hide terrible secrets. The calculated cruelty of the men on the Achille Lauro was a shock to the international community, proving that even a luxury vacation was no longer a safe haven. But as we move from the open sea to the crowded skies over Japan, we find a different kind of horror. There, the enemy wasn't a group of men with guns and manifestos, but a single hidden flaw in the very machines we trust to carry us home. It was a failure of steel and rivets that would lead to the most catastrophic single-plane disaster in history. Japan Airlines Flight 123 was a routine evening flight filled with people heading home for a major holiday. The cabin was warm, the passengers were relaxed, and the pilots were some of the most experienced in the fleet. It felt like the pinnacle of modern safety and efficiency. But deep within the tail of the Boeing 747, a ticking clock had been set 7 years earlier by a repair that was never supposed to happen. The transition from a quiet flight to a desperate struggle for survival was about to begin. On the early evening of August 12, 1985, Captain Masami Takahama was sitting in the cockpit of a Boeing 747 at Haneda Airport in Tokyo. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, orange shadows across the tarmac. Takahama was a veteran pilot with over 12,000 hours of flight time, known for his calm precision under pressure. He watched as the final passengers filed through the gate, his hands moving through the routine pre-flight checklist with practiced ease. It was the eve of the Obon holiday, a time when families across Japan returned to their ancestral homes to honor the spirits of the dead. Haneda was teeming with travelers carrying gift boxes of fruit and traditional sweets. Because of the holiday rush, Japan Airlines Flight 123 was completely booked. There were 509 passengers on board, ranging from infants in their parents' arms to elderly couples looking forward to a quiet week in the countryside of Osaka. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was festive and light. The Boeing 747, often called the Queen of the Skies, was a massive, double-decker aircraft that felt more like a flying hotel than a machine. Flight attendants moved through the aisles in their crisp uniforms, helping people find space for their bags. The air was filled with the sounds of excited children and the low hum of hundreds of conversations. For the passengers, this 45-minute hop to Osaka was just a small bridge to their vacation. Among the crowd was a young boy named Kenji, who was traveling alone to see his grandparents. He clutched a small toy airplane in his lap, looking out the window at the ground crew. In another row, a businessman named Hirotsugu Kawaguchi was settling into his seat, opening his briefcase to check a few documents one last time. These were ordinary people with ordinary plans, all trusting in the sophisticated technology of the most successful commercial jet ever built. The cabin was pressurized and cool. At exactly 6:12 in the evening, the four massive engines roared to life, and Flight 123 lifted off into the summer sky. Captain Takahama turned the nose toward the west, climbing steadily toward the cruising altitude of 24,000 feet. Everything was functioning perfectly. The seatbelt sign turned off, and the flight attendants began their initial cabin service. From the cockpit, the view of Sagami Bay was clear and beautiful, with the water reflecting the last light of the day. 12 minutes into the flight, as the plane reached its cruising altitude over the island of Oshima, a sudden and violent boom echoed through the entire airframe. The sound was like a massive hammer hitting the bottom of the ship. In the cabin, the ceiling panels above the rear lavatories buckled and fell. A thick cloud of white fog immediately filled the aisles as the pressurized air from the cabin rushed out into the thin atmosphere outside. The temperature dropped instantly. Captain Takahama felt the controls in his hands go limp. On the instrument panel, the warning lights for the hydraulic systems began to glow red, one after another. Within seconds, all 4 independent hydraulic lines had lost pressure. This meant that the pilots no longer had any physical connection to the wings or the tail. The massive airplane was now essentially a giant glider, moving through the sky with no way to steer. The captain's voice remained steady as he declared an emergency to Tokyo Control. In the back of the plane, the situation was even more terrifying. The explosion had not just caused a leak, it had literally blown the vertical stabilizer, the large tail fin, clean off the aircraft. Without that fin, the plane began to move in a rhythmic, sickening pattern known as a phugoid oscillation. The nose would pitch up until the plane lost speed, then it would dive toward the ocean before pitching up again. It was a terrifying roller coaster that the pilots could not stop. You are sitting in the middle of the cabin, gripped by a force that pushes you deep into your seat and then leaves you weightless. The oxygen masks have dropped from the ceiling, and the sound of the wind rushing through the fuselage is a constant, high-pitched scream. You look at the flight attendants, who are strapped into their seats, their faces pale but their voices calm as they instruct everyone to tighten their belts. The blue sea is visible through the windows, far below. Captain Takahama and his co-pilot, Yutaka Sasaki, were fighting a battle that no pilot had ever been trained for. They discovered that they could only influence the plane's movement by manually adjusting the thrust of the engines. If they pushed the left engines harder, the plane would turn right. It was a clumsy, exhausting process that required perfect coordination. For 32 minutes, they struggled to keep the 500-ton machine in the air, their muscles aching from the effort. As the plane continued its erratic dance across the sky, drifting toward the rugged mountains of central Japan, the passengers realized the gravity of their situation. There was no panic, only a heavy, profound silence. People began to reach for anything they could find: scraps of paper, the backs of air sickness bags, even the margins of newspapers. They began to write. They wrote goodbye notes to their wives, their children, and their parents, tucked into their pockets or wallets. Hirotsugu Kawaguchi, the businessman, pulled out a small notebook. His handwriting was shaky but legible as the plane bucked around him. He wrote to his children, telling them to be good to their mother and to work hard in school. He told them he was proud of them. He was not writing as a victim, but as a father who wanted his final words to be a map for his family's future. He folded the paper and placed it inside his suit jacket, pressing it close to his heart. The pilots managed to keep the aircraft aloft much longer than anyone at ground control thought possible. They were heading toward the dense forests of Mount Osutaka, a remote and jagged area of the Japanese Alps. The sun had completely set now, and the pilots were flying into a wall of dark peaks. They used every ounce of their strength, trying to clear the ridges by toggling the throttles, but the phugoid motion was becoming more violent as they lost altitude. At 6:56 in the evening, the right wing of Flight 123 clipped a ridge of trees. The impact was relatively small, but it was enough to send the crippled aircraft into a final, unavoidable roll. The massive Boeing 747 slammed into the side of the mountain at high speed, breaking apart into thousands of pieces. A massive fireball lit up the night sky, visible for miles. Then, there was only the sound of the wind moving through the scorched pines. Because the crash occurred in such a remote and vertical terrain, the Japanese search and rescue teams decided to wait until morning to begin the recovery operation. They believed that no one could have survived such a high-speed impact against a mountain. They spent the night preparing their equipment in the valley below. However, on the darkened slopes of Mount Osutaka, in the freezing mountain air, there were 4 people still breathing among the smoking ruins. One of the survivors was 12-year-old Keiko Kawakami. She had been thrown clear of the main wreckage and found herself tangled in the branches of a tree. She could hear the voices of other survivors calling out in the darkness, their cries getting weaker as the temperature dropped. She waited through the long, cold night, surrounded by the silence of the dead. It would be 14 hours before the first rescue helicopters arrived to find her and 3 other women. The investigation into the disaster began as soon as the black boxes were recovered from the charred hillside. Initially, people suspected a terrorist bomb or a structural failure in the new aircraft. But as the forensic engineers examined the wreckage of the rear pressure bulkhead, the dome that separates the cabin from the tail, they found a horrifying truth. The killer was not a person with a weapon, but a repair that had been done 7 years earlier. In 1978, this specific aircraft had suffered a minor accident where its tail struck the runway during a landing. The repair was carried out by a team of Boeing engineers. The technical manual required a specific doubler plate to be held in place by 2 rows of rivets to ensure its strength. Instead, the repair team had cut the plate in a way that left only a single row of rivets holding the entire pressure of the cabin. It was a fatal shortcut. For 7 years, every time the plane took off and landed, the pressure bulkhead expanded and contracted like a balloon. The single row of rivets was under a level of stress it was never designed to handle. Each flight caused tiny, invisible cracks to grow in the metal. On the evening of August 12th, the metal finally reached its breaking point. The bulkhead tore open, and the pressurized air exploded into the tail, blowing the stabilizer off like a cork from a bottle. The fallout from the investigation was devastating for both Boeing and Japan Airlines. While Boeing eventually admitted to the faulty repair, the emotional weight of the disaster fell heavily on the Japanese maintenance staff. In the Japanese corporate culture of the 1980s, the sense of responsibility for such a massive loss of life was absolute. The management of Japan Airlines felt a level of shame that could not be resolved through legal settlements or press releases. Hiro Tominaga was a maintenance manager for Japan Airlines who had been involved in overseeing the fleet's safety. Although he was not the one who performed the faulty repair 7 years earlier, he felt the burden of the 520 lives lost on his watch. A few months after the crash, he was found dead in his home. He had committed suicide as a way to offer a formal apology to the families of the victims, a final act of tragic corporate accountability. The story of JAL Flight 123 remains a cornerstone of aviation safety training today. It led to a total redesign of how pressure bulkheads are repaired and how hydraulic systems are routed through an aircraft. Engineers now ensure that no single failure can ever again lead to a total loss of control. The goodbye notes found in the pockets of the victims were eventually compiled into a book, serving as a heartbreaking testament to the human spirit under pressure. As hikers climb the steep, quiet trails of Mount Osutaka in 2026, the memorial on Mount Osutaka, known as the Hana no Sato, is still a place of pilgrimage. Every August, families climb the steep trail to the crash site to light incense and leave flowers. The forest has grown back over the scars on the mountain, but the rusted fragments of the aircraft are still being discovered by hikers. The site is considered sacred ground, a place where the lives of 520 people are remembered in the wind. 40 years after the disaster, Boeing continues to face intense scrutiny over its safety culture. In 2026, the company is still navigating the consequences of recent technical failures, often drawing comparisons to the negligence found in the 1985 investigation. The lessons of Flight 123 are a constant reminder that in the world of high-stakes engineering, there is no such thing as a small mistake. Every rivet and every bolt carries a life. The rhythmic thump of the rivets failing in the tail of a Boeing 747 was a sound that preceded one of the greatest tragedies in the history of flight. It was a failure born of a hidden flaw in a machine that everyone trusted. But as we move from the twisted metal on a Japanese mountainside to the quiet luxury of a mansion in Beverly Hills, we find a different kind of violence. There, the peace was shattered not by a mechanical error, but by a cold human choice. The Menendez home was a place of marble floors, expensive art, and a level of wealth that most people can only dream of. It felt like a fortress of success, a world away from the dangers of the street. But on a quiet night in August, the silence of the den was broken by a sound that had nothing to do with a failing engine or a political struggle. It was the sound of a family's secret history finally catching up with them in the most brutal way possible. On the night of August 20th, 1989, the Elm Drive neighborhood in Beverly Hills was as quiet as a museum. The air was cool and smelled of freshly cut grass, and the salt from the nearby Pacific. Inside the massive Mediterranean-style mansion at number 722, the lights were low. Jose Menendez and his wife Kitty were sitting on a plush sofa in the wood-paneled den, the blue light from the television flickering across the room. They were sharing a bowl of blueberries and cream, relaxing after a long weekend. Jose Menendez was the embodiment of the American dream. He had come to the United States from Cuba as a teenager with nothing and worked his way up to become a high-powered executive in the entertainment industry. He was a man who demanded excellence and discipline in everything, from his multi-million-dollar business deals to the way his two sons played competitive tennis. He was 51 years old, successful, and lived behind a gate that promised total security from the outside world. Kitty Menendez was a former pageant queen who had dedicated her life to her family and her husband's rising career. She was often seen at the most exclusive social events in Los Angeles, always perfectly dressed and poised. To the neighbors, they were the ultimate power couple, the kind of people who had everything. But inside the walls of the mansion, the atmosphere was often much more tense. Jose's drive for perfection created a heavy pressure that sat over the household like a thick fog. In the den, the television was playing the movie James Bond, The Spy Who Loved Me. The sound of the movie filled the room, a background noise that usually signaled a peaceful end to the day. The bowl of blueberries sat on the coffee table, half finished. Everything about the scene was incredibly normal, the kind of quiet evening that happens in thousands of homes every night. It was a moment of complete domestic stillness, where the biggest worry was the schedule for the following Monday morning. The front door of the mansion was unlocked, a rare lapse in the security that Jose usually insisted upon. Two figures walked into the house, moving quietly across the marble floors toward the back of the building. They were carrying 12-gauge Mossberg shotguns, weapons designed for maximum impact at close range. They didn't stop to talk or make any demands. They walked directly into the den where Jose and Kitty were still sitting on the sofa, their eyes fixed on the television screen. The first shot hit Jose in the back of the head, killing him almost instantly before he could even turn around. The sudden roar of the shotgun was deafening in the small enclosed room. Kitty screamed and tried to run toward the hallway, her feet slipping on the polished floor. The shooters didn't hesitate. They fired again and again, the room filling with white smoke and the sharp, acrid smell of burnt gunpowder. Within seconds, the quiet evening had been transformed into a scene of absolute carnage. Lyle and Eric Menendez, the two sons, called 911 a short time later. Their voices were frantic, filled with a high-pitched terror that seemed to vibrate through the phone line. They told the dispatcher that they had just come home from a movie and found their parents dead in the den. When the police arrived, they found the two brothers on the front lawn, sobbing and clutching each other. Lyle, the older brother at 23, was trying to be strong, while 18-year-old Eric seemed completely destroyed by the sight. Inside the den, the detectives found a scene that looked like a professional hit. The sheer volume of fire used suggested a level of hatred or a specific message. Because Jose was a high-level executive in the music and film industry, the initial theory was that this was a mob-related assassination. Perhaps he had crossed the wrong people in a business deal. The police began looking into Jose's professional life, checking for enemies in the boardrooms of Hollywood. For the first few days, the community rallied around the brothers. They were the grieving orphans of a tragedy that didn't make sense. But as the weeks went by, the detectives noticed a change in the way Lyle and Eric were behaving. They didn't act like young men who were afraid for their own lives after their parents had been murdered. Instead, they began to move through Beverly Hills with a newfound sense of freedom, as if a great weight had been lifted from their shoulders. Within 6 months of the murders, the Menendez brothers had spent approximately $700,000 of their parents' fortune. Lyle bought a full-time bodyguard, a Porsche Carrera, and several Rolex watches. Eric hired a full-time tennis coach and began investing in a high-end clothing business. They were eating at the most expensive restaurants in Los Angeles every night, often seen laughing and ordering the finest wines. This level of spending was so extreme that it caught the attention of the investigators. The professional hit theory began to fade away as the detectives looked closer at the sons. They realized that the brothers had been the ones to purchase the shotguns just days before the murders, using a stolen driver's license. The pressure was mounting, and the cracks began to show in Eric's composure. He was the more sensitive of the two, and the weight of the secret was starting to eat him alive. He began to have nightmares and trouble sleeping, his health declining as the months passed. Eric eventually made an appointment with his psychologist, Dr. Jerome Oziel. During a session in late October, the guilt finally broke through his defenses. He confessed everything to the doctor, describing the night in the den in vivid detail. He told the doctor that they couldn't take the pressure anymore and that they had planned the whole thing. Lyle soon joined the session, and instead of being remorseful, he reportedly threatened the doctor, telling him that he would be killed if he ever spoke to the police. The secret might have stayed in that office if it weren't for a woman named Judalon Smythe. She was Dr. Oziel's mistress, and she had been listening at the door during the brothers' confession. She was terrified of what she had heard, and even more terrified of the brothers. After her relationship with the doctor soured, she went to the police and told them everything she knew. This was the breakthrough the detectives had been waiting for. In March of 1990, Lyle and Eric were arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The trial of the Menendez brothers became one of the first major media sensations of the cable news era. It was broadcast live into millions of homes, turning the courtroom into a national theater. The prosecution argued that the motive was simple: greed. They presented the evidence of the brothers' spending spree and the cold-blooded nature of the killings. They painted a picture of two spoiled young men who killed their parents because they didn't want to wait for their inheritance and they didn't want to follow their father's rules. But the defense, led by Leslie Abramson, presented a much darker story. She argued that the brothers were not killers for money, but victims of a lifetime of horrific physical, emotional, and sexual abuse at the hands of their father. They claimed that Kitty Menendez knew about the abuse but did nothing to stop it. According to the defense, the brothers killed their parents out of a perfectly reasonable fear that Jose was going to kill them to keep his secrets from being revealed to the world. This abuse defense split the public down the middle. To some, the brothers were cold-blooded monsters who were using a tragic lie to escape the death penalty. To others, they were broken children who had finally snapped after years of secret torture. The first trial ended in a hung jury, as the jurors could not agree on whether it was murder or manslaughter. The brothers remained in jail, their faces still on the front of every tabloid in the country, while the legal teams prepared for a second round. In the second trial, the judge limited much of the testimony regarding the abuse, focusing more on the physical evidence of the crime. This time, the jury was not as conflicted. In March of 1996, Lyle and Eric Menendez were convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. They were spared the death penalty but were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. They were sent to separate prisons, and it would be decades before they saw each other again. Life in prison was a stark contrast to the marble floors of Beverly Hills. Lyle and Eric spent years in high-security facilities, adjusting to a world where their name and their money meant nothing. They both got married while behind bars and focused on rehabilitation programs. Over time, they became advocates for other inmates who had suffered from childhood trauma. They remained a source of fascination for the public, with new documentaries and series being made about their case every few years. In 2018, after 22 years apart, the brothers were finally reunited when Lyle was moved to the same facility as Eric in San Diego. They reportedly fell into each other's arms and cried for minutes. Since their reunion, they have worked together on a project called The Green Space, turning a drab prison yard into a park with murals and plants. It is a strange, quiet end for 2 men whose lives were once defined by the most violent and public explosion of a family unit imaginable. The question of whether they were truly victims or just cold-blooded killers continues to be debated. The Menendez case changed the way the legal system looks at the abuse excuse and highlighted the deep dysfunction that can hide behind the gates of a wealthy home. We want to believe that we can spot a monster, but Lyle and Eric looked like every other college student in California. The horror of their story lies in the fact that the most dangerous people in their lives were sitting in the same room. In the crowded visiting rooms of the San Diego prison system in 2026, the legal status of the Menendez brothers has seen its most significant movement in 30 years. In May of 2025, following a massive public campaign and the emergence of new evidence regarding Jose's history of abuse, a judge granted a resentencing hearing. They were resentenced to 50 years to life, which made them eligible for parole. However, their first bids for freedom in late 25 were denied by the board, who cited the gravity of the original crime. Lyle and Eric remain at the Richard J. Donovan Correctional Facility in San Diego today. They are now men in their 50s, having spent more than half of their lives in the prison system. They continue to wait for their next chance at a hearing, while their lawyers argue that they have been fully rehabilitated and have paid their debt to society. The mansion on Elm Drive has been sold multiple times, but for many, it remains a dark landmark in the history of Los Angeles. The smell of expensive cologne and gunpowder in the den that night was a sign of a world that had completely collapsed. It was a tragedy that began with blueberries and cream and ended in a life of concrete and steel. The Menendez brothers are a reminder that the stories we tell the world are often very different from the reality we live at home. Sometimes, the most terrifying thing about a house is the people who are supposed to love you the most. While the Menendez brothers were navigating the aftermath of their choices in the hills of California, thousands of miles to the north, a different kind of darkness was taking shape in the halls of an engineering school in Montreal. There, the violence wouldn't be born of family trauma or a struggle for money, but from a deep, calculated hatred for an entire group of people. In the quiet of a university campus, a man was preparing to turn a classroom into a place of historic mourning. The École Polytechnique was a place of science, progress, and ambition. It was where the next generation of engineers went to build their futures. It felt like a safe, intellectual community where the only thing that mattered was your grades and your ideas. But on a cold December afternoon in 1989, the sound of a semi-automatic rifle would prove that even the most modern institutions are vulnerable to the oldest kind of hate. The peace of a snowy afternoon was about to be broken. On the afternoon of December 6, 1989, the campus of the École Polytechnique in Montreal was covered in a thick, fresh layer of snow. Inside the university buildings, the air was warm and hummed with the sound of students preparing for their final exams of the fall semester. It was a Wednesday, and many young people were looking forward to the upcoming holiday break and the end of a long, difficult term of engineering studies. Maurice Lagagnère was 25 years old and worked as a budget clerk at the university's finance department. She was a person who took great pride in her organizational skills and her ability to keep the complicated books of the school in perfect order. Maurice was known for her bright smile and her willingness to help any student who walked into her office with a question about their tuition or their paperwork. She was just beginning to pack up her things for the day. The École Polytechnique was more than just a school. It was a symbol of progress in the province of Quebec. For decades, the field of engineering had been dominated by men, but by the late 1980s, that was finally starting to change. More and more women were enrolling in the difficult math and science courses, eager to build bridges, design machines, and lead the nation into a new era of technology. The hallways were filled with a sense of ambition and shared purpose. Geneviève Bergeron was a 21-year-old student who was also a talented singer and a dedicated athlete. She was sitting in a second-floor classroom, her mind focused on the complex mechanical engineering formulas on the chalkboard. She had spent the last few weeks studying late into the night, driven by a desire to prove that she could excel in one of the most demanding programs in the country. To her, the school was a place where your hard work mattered more than your gender. At around 5 o'clock in the evening, a 25-year-old man named Marc Lépine walked through the main entrance of the building. He was dressed in a casual jacket and blue jeans, carrying a long, thin package wrapped in a plastic garbage bag. He didn't look like a student, but he also didn't look particularly out of place in a building where people were constantly moving equipment for projects. He moved with a slow, deliberate pace, heading toward the registration office on the first floor. The man walked into the office where Maurice Lagagnère was working and stood there for a moment without saying a word. He didn't ask for a form or look for a specific person. He simply reached into the plastic bag and pulled out a Ruger Mini 14 semi-automatic rifle. It was a weapon designed for hunting, but in the confined space of the office, it looked like something from a battlefield. Before Maurice could even process what was happening, the man raised the rifle and fired. Maurice was the first to fall. The sound of the shots echoed through the hallway, but at first, many students thought it was a prank or some kind of construction noise. The man didn't linger in the office to look for more victims. He turned and walked back out into the corridor, his face completely devoid of emotion. He began to move toward the stairs, heading for the upper floors where the afternoon classes were still in session. He was moving with a terrifying, single-minded focus. On the second floor, in room 230, a professor was wrapping up a lecture on thermodynamics. There were about 60 students in the room, sitting in rows of wooden desks. The door opened suddenly, and the man with the rifle stepped inside. He ordered everyone to stop what they were doing and to listen to him. His voice was calm but had a sharp, brittle edge to it. He walked to the front of the room, the barrel of the rifle pointed at the ceiling, and told everyone to stay where they were. The man ordered the men and the women to separate into two different groups on opposite sides of the room. The students were confused, thinking it might be a dramatic political demonstration or a strange role-playing exercise for a psychology class. But as the man's tone became more aggressive, the atmosphere in the room shifted from confusion to a cold, paralyzing fear. The 9 women in the class were forced to stand against the wall, while the 50 men were told to move toward the door. One of the female students, a young woman named Natalie Provost, tried to speak to the gunman. She told him that they were just students trying to learn, and that they hadn't done anything to him. The man looked at her with a deep, burning resentment. He told her that he was there to fight feminism. He believed that women like her were taking the places of men in the professional world, and that they were responsible for the failures in his own life. He didn't see them as people, but as enemies. You are standing against the cold plaster wall of room 230, your heart hammering against your ribs. You look at the faces of the women beside you, seeing the same disbelief and terror reflected in their eyes. The man in front of you is not much older than a student himself, but the way he holds the rifle shows that he is perfectly comfortable with the power he now has. The silence in the room is so heavy that you can hear the soft rustle of the snow hitting the window. The gunman told the men to leave the room. As they shuffled out into the hallway, many of them looked back, unsure of what they should do. They were unarmed and facing a man with a semi-automatic weapon. Once the men were gone, the man turned his full attention back to the 9 women. He didn't give them a chance to speak again. He opened fire, moving the rifle from left to right in a slow, sweeping motion. The sound in the small classroom was absolutely deafening. 6 of the women in room 230 were killed instantly. The others were wounded but managed to drop to the floor and stay still, hoping the man would think they were dead. The man stood over them for a few seconds, the smell of burnt gunpowder filling the room. He didn't show any sign of satisfaction or remorse. He simply turned around, walked out of the classroom, and began to move through the hallways once again, looking for more targets in the offices and lounges. The man spent the next 20 minutes moving through 3 different floors of the university. He walked into the cafeteria where dozens of people were eating dinner and began to fire into the crowd. He targeted women specifically, ignoring the men who were diving under the tables for cover. He moved into the library and through the corridors, his presence marked by the rhythmic, mechanical sound of his rifle firing. The school, which had been so full of life and ambition, was now a place of silent, frozen horror. In a different part of the second floor, Geneviève Bergeron was caught in a hallway as the gunman approached. She was a bright, talented young woman with a future that should have included music and engineering. She was one of the 14 women who would not go home that night. The man didn't stop until he reached another classroom on the 3rd floor. By then, the university was surrounded by police cars and ambulances, their sirens wailing against the quiet of the snowy Montreal evening. As the police began to move into the building, the man realized that his mission was coming to an end. He sat down at a desk in the back of a classroom, the rifle resting on the floor beside him. He took off his jacket and revealed a 3-page suicide note tucked into his pocket. He didn't wait for the officers to reach the door. He took his own life, ending the 20 minutes of violence that had forever changed the history of Canada. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the sound of the shots. The investigation into the massacre was one of the most thorough in the nation's history. Detectives spent months analyzing the man's past and his final manifesto. They discovered that Marc Lépine was a man who had faced constant rejection in his personal and professional life. He had tried to join the military and had been rejected. He had applied to the École Polytechnique and had been turned down. He had internalized these failures and turned them into a violent hatred for women who were succeeding. The suicide note found on his body was a chilling document. It contained a list of 19 prominent Quebec women whom he considered to be radical feminists and whom he intended to kill if he had the chance. The list included journalists, politicians, and union leaders. The note made it clear that the attack at the school was not a random act of madness, but a calculated political execution. He had spent months planning the day, choosing his weapon and his target with a cold, logical precision. The funeral for the 14 victims was attended by thousands of people, including the Prime Minister of Canada. The entire country was in a state of mourning, but also in a state of deep soul-searching. The massacre forced a national conversation about violence against women and the prevalence of misogyny in society. It shattered the illusion that Canada was immune to the kind of mass shootings that were becoming common in the United States. The names of the 14 women became a permanent part of the national memory. One of the most significant outcomes of the tragedy was the push for stricter gun control laws. The fact that the gunman had been able to legally purchase a semi-automatic rifle and move through a school for 20 minutes without being stopped was unacceptable to the public. This led to the passage of the Firearms Act in 1995, which introduced a comprehensive licensing and registration system for all gun owners in Canada. The law was a direct legacy of the lives lost on that snowy December afternoon. Every year on December 6th, the people of Montreal gather at a memorial site near the university. 14 searchlights are shown into the night sky, one for each of the women who died. The day has been designated as the National Day of Remembrance and Action on Violence Against Women. It is a time for reflection, but also for a commitment to ensuring that such a thing never happens again. The École Polytechnique itself has become a leader in promoting gender equality in the field of engineering. As the 14 searchlights cut through the cold, snowy Montreal sky in early 2026, the memory of the École Polytechnique massacre is as strong as ever. The university has established scholarships in the names of the victims, ensuring that their legacy lives on through the work of the women who follow in their footsteps. The site where the searchlights are lit has become a place of quiet power, a reminder of the resilience of the community. The students who walk the hallways today are taught the history of that day as a vital part of their education. The shooter, Marc Lapine, is buried in an unmarked grave, his name rarely spoken except in the context of the crime he committed. His father, a man with a history of domestic violence, has also passed away. The family of the gunman has spent decades living in the shadow of his actions, a reminder that the ripples of such a tragedy extend far beyond the victims themselves. The manifesto he wrote is now a piece of historical evidence, a window into a mind that was consumed by a very specific kind of poison. The silence in the hallways of the École Polytechnique on that December night was eventually broken by the sound of construction and the return of the students. Life moved on, as it always does, but it moved on differently. The school became a more secure place, and the country became more aware of the darkness that can hide in plain sight. The 14 women are remembered not as victims, but as pioneers who were taken too soon. Their story is a reminder of the high price that is sometimes paid for progress. The calculated hatred of a man who viewed his failures as the fault of an entire gender led to a tragedy that redefined a nation's laws and its conscience. But as we move from the snow-covered campus of Montreal to the cramped, neon-lit apartments of Tokyo, we find a different kind of obsession. There, the darkness didn't come from a political manifesto, but from a man who had retreated so far into his own fantasy world that the line between fiction and reality simply ceased to exist for him. The apartment was filled from floor to ceiling with thousands of VHS tapes, a collection of horror and animation that served as the man's only connection to the world. He was a person who felt invisible, a man who believed that the only way to be seen was to commit acts that were too horrific to ignore. In the quiet neighborhoods of Tokyo and Saitama, he began to hunt for the most innocent targets he could find. The transition from a lonely collector to a national monster was about to happen. On a warm afternoon in August 1988, 4-year-old Mari Kano was playing outside her home in the quiet suburbs of Saitama, Japan. The air was thick with the sound of cicadas and the distant hum of traffic from the nearby highway. Mari was a happy, energetic little girl who loved to explore the small parks in her neighborhood. Her mother had stepped inside for just a moment, keeping the front door slightly cracked so she could hear her daughter's laughter. But when she walked back out onto the porch a few minutes later, the small plastic toys were scattered on the grass, and the sidewalk was completely empty. The search for Mari began immediately, involving hundreds of neighbors and local police officers who combed through the nearby woods and construction sites. They checked the local train stations and interviewed every shopkeeper in the district, but no one had seen a small girl in a summer dress. There were no witnesses, no sounds of a struggle, and no suspicious vehicles reported in the area. It was as if Mari had simply evaporated into the humid summer air. For her parents, the silence of the house became a heavy, suffocating weight as the days turned into weeks with no word from the investigators. 2 months later, in October, the nightmare expanded to a neighboring district. 7-year-old Masami Yoshizawa was walking home from her primary school, her colorful backpack bouncing as she hurried along the familiar path. She was a bright student who always followed the safety rules her parents had taught her. She never spoke to strangers and always stayed on the main roads. Yet, she never made it to her front door. Once again, there were no clues left behind. The police were forced to realize that they weren't dealing with a simple runaway case, but with something far more calculated and predatory. By December, a third girl named Erika Nanba, only 4 years old, disappeared from a park in the middle of the day. The pattern was becoming terrifyingly clear, yet the police had no physical evidence to link the cases. The media began to report on the Saitama child murders, and a wave of panic swept through the families of the region. Parents began to walk their children directly into the school buildings, and the playgrounds that were once full of life became eerie, abandoned spaces. Everyone was looking for a monster, but they had no idea what that monster was supposed to look like. You are sitting in a quiet, dark room in a house in Tokyo, the only light coming from the flickering blue glow of a television screen. The walls around you are completely hidden behind thousands of VHS tapes, stacked from the floor to the ceiling in jagged, unstable towers. The air is stale, smelling of old plastic and dust that has settled over years of isolation. You spend your nights watching these tapes over and over again, lost in a world of animation and horror that feels more real than the people outside. To the rest of the world, you are invisible, a man who doesn't quite fit into the rhythm of the city. The man in the room was Tsutomu Miyazaki. He was 26 years old and worked a part-time job at his father's local printing business. Since he was a child, Tsutomu had been deeply self-conscious about a physical deformity. His wrists were permanently fused, meaning he could not rotate his hands. This condition made him feel clumsy and alienated from his peers. He had retreated into a massive collection of over 6,000 videotapes, ranging from children's cartoons to the most graphic slasher films he could find. He lived in a fantasy world where he held the power that he felt he lacked in reality. In early 1989, the families of the missing girls began to receive strange, taunting communications. A letter arrived at the home of Mari Kano's parents, written in a shaky, disjointed script. It was signed with the name Imada Kanako, a female pseudonym that the killer had invented. The letter didn't demand money or make political statements. Instead, it described the details of Mari's disappearance in a way that only the person responsible could know. It was a cold, cruel attempt to extend the trauma of the family, proving that the kidnapper was still watching them and enjoying their pain. The most horrific communication arrived in February. Mari's parents found a small cardboard box on their doorstep. Inside, tucked away in a piece of fabric, was a small collection of bones and ashes. A note included in the box claimed that these were the remains of their daughter. The level of psychological cruelty was unprecedented in Japanese criminal history. The killer wasn't just taking lives, he was treating the grief of the families as a form of entertainment. The forensic team confirmed that the remains were indeed human, though the process of identification took months of painstaking work. In June 1989, a fourth girl named Ayako Nomoto disappeared. The pressure on the Japanese National Police Agency reached a breaking point. They had thousands of officers assigned to the case, but they were looking for a high-profile criminal or a professional kidnapper. They didn't realize that the person they were looking for was a quiet, unassuming man who drove a small, beat-up car and spent his free time at local animation conventions. Tsutomu Miyazaki was able to move through the suburbs unnoticed because he looked like a person who was too timid to ever cause harm. The breakthrough in the case happened on July 23, 1989, not through brilliant detective work, but through the courage of a father in Hachioji. He was at a local park when he noticed a man with a camera following his young daughter. The man looked nervous and was trying to entice the girl toward the bushes. The father didn't hesitate. He confronted the stranger and demanded to know what he was doing. The man tried to stammer an excuse about being a professional photographer, but the father grabbed him and held him until the local patrol officers arrived on the scene. The man was taken into custody for indecent exposure and attempted assault. At first, the officers at the local station had no idea they had the most wanted man in Japan in their interrogation room. They processed him as a petty offender, but a detective noticed something interesting in the man's car. There were several rolls of undeveloped film and a few children's toys that didn't seem to belong to a 26-year-old bachelor. They decided to run his fingerprints and check his background. Within 24 hours, the quiet printer's son was the primary suspect in the Saitama murders. When the police finally entered Tsutomu's room in his father's house, they were stunned by what they found. The sheer volume of the video collection was overwhelming. They found 6,000 tapes, many of them containing news reports about the disappearances of the 4 girls. Hidden among the professional tapes were several recordings that Tsutomu had made himself. These tapes showed the reality of his crimes, documenting the locations where he had taken the girls and the way he had treated their remains. The flickering blue light of the television had been the silent witness to an unimaginable darkness. Tsutomu Miyazaki was remarkably calm during his initial confessions. He spoke about the girls as if they were characters in one of his animated films, showing almost no emotional connection to the physical reality of his actions. He told the investigators that he had committed the murders to reanimate his grandfather, who had recently passed away. He believed that by performing ritualistic acts and preserving the remains, he could bring back the only person who had ever truly understood him. His logic was a twisted bridge between his childhood trauma and the horror films he had watched for thousands of hours. The details that emerged during the trial were so disturbing that the Japanese media struggled with how to report them. Tsutomu admitted to acts of necrophilia and even cannibalism, claiming that he wanted to incorporate the girls into his own body so they would never leave him. He described the way he had waited in his car for hours, watching the parks and the school routes, until he saw a child who looked particularly vulnerable. He used his gentle, stuttering voice to gain their trust, often pretending to be lost or in need of help with his camera equipment. The defense team tried to argue that Tsutomu suffered from an extreme form of multiple personality disorder. They claimed that the Yamada Kanako persona was a separate entity that had taken control of his mind. During the proceedings, Tsutomu often sat in the courtroom drawing strange, childish sketches of a character he called the Rat Man. He would tell the judge that the Rat Man was the one who told him what to do. However, the court-appointed psychiatrists found that while he was deeply disturbed, he was fully aware of the nature of his actions and the difference between right and wrong. The trial lasted for years, as the legal system struggled to categorize a criminal like Miyazaki. He was the first person in Japan to be labeled an otaku by the mainstream media, a term that originally meant a dedicated hobbyist but was now being used to describe a dangerous, antisocial loner obsessed with fantasy. This caused a massive moral panic across the country, with parents and politicians calling for the censorship of horror films and animation. The term otaku became a stigma that would take decades for the Japanese youth culture to eventually reclaim and redefine. In 1997, the Tokyo District Court finally delivered its verdict. Tsutomu Miyazaki was found guilty on all counts and was sentenced to death by hanging. The judge noted that the level of cruelty and the lack of remorse shown by the defendant made any chance of rehabilitation impossible. Tsutomu listened to the sentence without any visible reaction, his fused wrists resting quietly in his lap. He spent the next 11 years in a high-security prison, filing various appeals that were all eventually rejected by the Supreme Court, as the evidence against him was considered absolute. The final chapter of his story was written on June 17, 2008. At the age of 45, Tsutomu Miyazaki was executed at the Tokyo Detention House. His death was greeted with a sense of quiet relief by the families of the 4 girls, though the trauma of the late 80s would never truly fade. The case had changed the way Japan looked at its own society, exposing the deep holes in the social fabric where a person could disappear into a world of violent fantasy for years without anyone noticing the warning signs. It is a chilling observation to realize that the most profound horrors are often hidden behind the most ordinary doors. Tsutomu Miyazaki lived in a regular house, worked a regular job, and was polite to his neighbors. He didn't look like a villain from a movie. He looked like a man who was simply too shy to speak up. The 6,000 tapes in his room were a wall that he built to keep the world out, but they also served as a screen where he could project his darkest desires until they became his only reality. Walking through the crowded neon streets of Tokyo in 2026, the otaku killer remains the most studied serial killer in Japanese history. The term otaku has evolved into a multi-billion-dollar global industry, and the stigma associated with the Miyazaki case has largely faded among the younger generation. However, the police files from the investigation are still used to train detectives in behavioral analysis and digital forensics. The parks in Saitama are now equipped with modern security cameras and emergency call boxes, a permanent physical response to the fear that began in 1988. The memory of Mari, Masami, Erika, and Ayako is preserved in small, quiet memorials located near the spots where they were last seen. These are not grand monuments, but simple places where people leave fresh flowers and small toys every year. They serve as a reminder that the cost of social isolation and unchecked obsession is often paid by the most innocent among us. The story of Tsutomu Miyazaki is a dark milestone in the history of the 1980s, marking the moment when the digital and the physical worlds first collided in a way that was truly lethal. The flicker of a television screen in a dark room in Tokyo was a sign of a life that had completely detached from the human experience. It was a tragedy built on the silence of a man who felt invisible. But as we move from the cramped apartments of Japan to the golden rice fields of Hwasong, South Korea, we find a different kind of silence. There, the killer didn't have a collection of tapes or a pseudonym. He was a shadow that moved through the moonlight, leaving behind a community paralyzed by a fear that would last for over 30 years. Hwasong was a rural area where the seasons dictated the pace of life. People worked the land and looked out for one another, trusting in the familiar faces of their neighbors. But in the autumn of 1986, the fields became a place of terror. Women began to disappear during their walk home from work, and their bodies were found in the irrigation ditches, bound with their own clothing. The police launched the largest investigation in the country's history, but the man they were looking for seemed to have the ability to vanish like smoke into the night. On the evening of September 15, 1986, the rural district of Hwasong was settling into its usual quiet rhythm. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the vast golden rice fields in a state of soft blue twilight. A 71-year-old woman named Lee Wan-I-am was walking along a narrow dirt path that cut through the paddies. She was heading home after visiting her daughter's house nearby, her footsteps light on the dry earth as the first stars began to appear in the clear autumn sky. Lee Wan-I-am was a woman who had lived through the hardest decades of Korean history. She had raised children during times of scarcity and had seen the country transform from a war-torn landscape into a rising industrial power. In her small village, she was known as a grandmother to everyone, always ready with a kind word or a bit of dried fruit for the local children. She enjoyed her evening walks, finding comfort in the familiar scent of the damp soil and the steady rhythmic sound of the cicadas in the tall grass. The district of Hwasong was a place where people felt a deep sense of collective safety. It was a community of farmers and factory workers who had known each other for generations. People rarely locked their doors, and it was common for women to walk alone between the villages well after dark. The only real concern for most residents was the weather or the price of the harvest. The idea that a predatory stranger could be moving through the shadows of the paddies was something that simply didn't exist in their world. As Lee Wan-I-am reached a particularly secluded stretch of the path, where the bushes grew thick along the irrigation ditch, she noticed a slight movement in the tall grass. At first, she might have thought it was a stray dog or perhaps a neighbor looking for a lost tool. She slowed her pace, her eyes adjusting to the deepening shadows. The transition from a peaceful walk to a moment of confusion happened in a heartbeat. The cicadas seemed to go silent all at once, leaving only the sound of a heavy footstep on the grass behind her. The following morning, a local farmer was out checking his irrigation valves when he noticed something unusual in the deep grass of the ditch. He climbed down to investigate, thinking it might be a piece of discarded trash that would clog the water flow. Instead, he found the body of Lee Won-I-am. She had been strangled with her own clothing, her hands bound behind her back in a complex, ritualistic series of knots. There were no signs of a robbery. It was a scene of calculated personal violence that the village had never seen before. The local police arrived within the hour, but they were completely unprepared for what they found. In 1986, South Korean rural police were mostly accustomed to dealing with property disputes or occasional drunken brawls. They didn't have a forensics team, and they didn't have a protocol for preserving a crime scene. Dozens of curious onlookers trampled the area before any evidence could be collected. The detectives looked at the elderly victim and struggled to find a motive. Who would want to kill a 71-year-old grandmother? You are walking through the high grass of the Hwasong fields at night, a few weeks after the first murder. The moon is a thin sliver in the sky, providing just enough light to see the outline of the irrigation ditches. Every rustle of the wind through the rice stalks sounds like a footstep. Every shadow seems to take on a human shape. You realize that the geography of your home has changed. The fields are no longer a source of life and work. They have become a maze where someone is waiting for the perfect moment to step out. A second murder occurred just a few weeks later, followed by a third in December. The victim this time was a 25-year-old woman named Pak Hyun-suk, who disappeared while walking home from her job at a local garment factory. Like the first victim, she was found in an irrigation ditch, bound and strangled with her own stockings. The police now realized they were facing something far more terrifying than a single act of violence. They were facing a serial killer who was using the landscape of Hwasong as his own private hunting ground. The atmosphere in the district shifted from concern to absolute terror. The government launched the largest police operation in the history of the country. Over 2 million police man-days were eventually dedicated to the case. They set up checkpoints on every major road and patrolled the fields with flashlights every night. They questioned over 20,000 men, and the fingerprints of tens of thousands more were cross-referenced with the limited evidence found at the scenes. Yet, the killer seemed to know exactly where the police were not looking. Detective Ha Sung-moo was one of the lead investigators assigned to the Hwasong task force. He spent his days walking the muddy paths and his nights staring at the crime scene photos in a cramped, smoke-filled office. He was a man driven by a quiet, burning frustration. He could feel the killer's presence in the village, a ghost that moved through the community and then vanished. Every time they thought they had a suspect, the DNA or the alibi would fall through, and another body would be found a few weeks later. The killer's signature was becoming more specific and more disturbing with each new victim. He used the women's own personal items, their scarves, their stockings, their blouses, to bind them and end their lives. He often left the bodies in places where they were sure to be found quickly, as if he wanted the community to see his work. He showed a level of geographic knowledge that suggested he was someone who lived or worked in the area, someone who could blend into a crowd of farmers without raising a single suspicion. By 1988, the Hwasong serial murders were national news. Superstitions began to take hold of the population. A rumor spread that the killer only targeted women wearing red, leading to a complete disappearance of red clothing from the streets of the district. Women began to carry whistles and small knives, and a voluntary curfew was established. After the sun went down, the streets of Hwasong became a ghost town, with the only lights coming from the police lanterns swaying in the distance across the dark rice paddies. The seventh victim was found in September 1988. She was a 54-year-old woman who had been heading home after a long day of work. The police found a single footprint in the mud near the body, along with a small sample of hair that didn't belong to the victim. They felt they were finally getting close. They brought in international experts and used the most advanced technology available at the time. But the science of DNA was still in its infancy, and the samples were often too contaminated to provide a clear profile of the suspect. The murders continued until April 1991, when the 10th victim was discovered, and then, as suddenly as it had started, the killings stopped. The ghost of Hwaseong seemed to have simply walked back into the shadows and disappeared. For the next 30 years, the case remained the most famous cold case in South Korean history. It inspired books, television shows, and the legendary film Memories of Murder. But for the families of the 10 women, there was no closure, only a lingering fear that the man who had destroyed their lives was still out there. Detective Ha Sung-moo eventually retired from the force, but he never truly left the case behind. He kept a private file in his home, filled with the names and faces of the women he had failed to protect. He often returned to the fields of Hwaseong, walking the paths that were now paved and surrounded by modern apartment buildings. He wondered if he had ever brushed shoulders with the killer at a market or a bus stop. The silence of the fields was a weight that he carried into his old age, a debt that felt impossible to pay. In September 2019, 33 years after the first murder, the Korean National Police Agency announced a massive breakthrough. They had used new, highly sensitive DNA testing techniques on the evidence preserved from the 5th, 7th, and 9th crime scenes. The results provided a perfect match for a 56-year-old man named Lee Chun-jae. The ghost finally had a name and a face. However, there was a shocking twist to the discovery. Lee Chun-jae wasn't hiding in a remote village or living under a false identity. He was already in prison. Lee Chun-jae had been serving a life sentence since 1994 for the murder of his sister-in-law. For 25 years, he had been a model prisoner, described by guards as a quiet, ordinary man who never caused any trouble. When the detectives first confronted him with the DNA evidence, he initially denied everything. But as the weight of the scientific proof became undeniable, the dam finally broke. He didn't just confess to the 10 Hwaseong murders. He confessed to 4 additional killings and over 30 sexual assaults. During his confession, Lee Chun-jae spoke with a chilling level of detachment. He told the investigators that he had often seen the police patrolling the fields while he was hiding just a few yards away in the bushes. He described how he would watch the flashlights moving in the dark, feeling a sense of power as the officers walked right past him. He admitted that he didn't have a specific reason for the killings. He simply felt a compulsion that he didn't bother to fight. He was a predator who had operated in plain sight for years. The revelation of the killer's identity brought a mixture of relief and renewed pain to the community. Because the statute of limitations for the Hwaseong murders had expired years ago, Lee Chun-jae could not be officially prosecuted or sentenced for those specific crimes. This legal reality was a bitter pill for the families to swallow. However, because he was already serving a life sentence, he would never be released. The truth was finally a matter of public record, and the names of the innocent women were finally cleared of the rumors that had surrounded them for decades. I think about how the truth is like a seed buried deep in the mud of a rice field. It might stay hidden for a long time, covered by layers of history and silence, but it never truly disappears. It waits for the right moment, for the right technology, or the right person to come along and dig it up. For 30 years, the ghost of Hwaseong was a myth, but in the end, it was just a man. A man who was ordinary enough to be ignored, but whose actions left a scar on an entire nation. Beneath the high-rise apartment buildings and shopping malls of modern Hwaseong in 2026, Lee Chun-jae remains at the Busan Penitentiary. He is in his 60s now, and reportedly spends his days in quiet reflection. He has lost the physical strength that allowed him to move through the fields like a shadow, but his presence in the prison system is a constant reminder of the failure of the 1980s legal framework. The South Korean government has since abolished the statute of limitations for first-degree murder, ensuring that no future killer can ever again hide behind the calendar. The district of Hwaseong is now a thriving urban center, part of the sprawling Greater Seoul area. The irrigation ditches have been replaced by concrete drainage systems, and the golden rice fields are mostly gone, covered by shopping malls and high-rise schools. Most of the people living there today have no memory of the curfew or the fear of wearing red. But on a quiet autumn evening, when the wind blows through the remaining patches of grass, the older residents still look toward the shadows and remember the sound of the cicadas. The investigation into Lee Chun-jae also led to the exoneration of a man named Yoon Song-yo, who had spent 20 years in prison after being wrongfully convicted of one of the Hwaseong murders. In 2020, the court officially declared his innocence, and he was awarded state compensation. This was a final, tragic layer to the case that the fear of the 1980s had led to the destruction of even more lives than the killer had taken himself. The system had been as blind as the night fields. The legacy of the Hwasong murders is now a part of the national identity, a story of a community's endurance and the eventual triumph of science over silence. The detectives who worked the case for decades finally found their peace, though they still carry the memories of the victims. Every year, a small group of people still gathers near the site of the first discovery to leave flowers and light incense. They ensure that the 10 women are remembered not for the way they died, but for the lives they were living before the shadows moved. The quiet, rural terror of the Korean fields was a tragedy that spanned 3 decades before the light of the truth finally reached the bottom of the ditch. It was a story of a ghost who turned out to be a neighbor. But as we move from the golden rice of Hwasong to the cold, winter barracks of Romania, we find a different kind of ending. There, the transition from a decade of silence to a moment of absolute violence didn't take 30 years. It happened in the span of a single afternoon, on a day that was supposed to be a celebration. The 1980s were coming to a close, and a long-standing regime was beginning to crumble under the weight of its own history. The man who had ruled with an iron hand for decades was about to find out that his power was as fragile as a sheet of ice on a Romanian river. He had built a fortress of fear, but he didn't realize that the people inside the walls were no longer afraid. The transition from a dictator's palace to a cold courtyard with a firing squad would happen with a speed that shocked the world. On Christmas Day, 1989, the air in the town of Târgoviște was biting and sharp. A small military building was surrounded by soldiers who were no longer taking orders from their commanders. Inside, a man and a woman who had once been treated like gods were being forced to face a reality they had spent a lifetime avoiding. They were sitting at a small wooden table, listening to a list of crimes that felt like a summary of the decade itself. The final act of the 1980s was about to be carried out in a storm of lead. On the morning of December 25th, 1989, a bitter wind was whipping through the military barracks in the small town of Târgoviște, Romania. The sky was a flat, heavy gray, promising more snow before the day was over. Inside a cramped, poorly lit room, 2 elderly people sat at a small wooden table, still wearing their expensive winter coats. They looked out of place against the peeling paint and the bare light bulbs. The man adjusted his hat, his hands trembling slightly from the cold, or perhaps from something much deeper. Nicolae Ceausescu had ruled Romania for over 20 years, with a level of absolute authority that few men in history have ever achieved. He was 71 years old, a man who had seen himself as the father of his nation, the great conductor. In his own mind, he was a beloved figure who had brought modernization and pride to his people. He lived in a world of marble palaces and gold-plated bathrooms, surrounded by a small circle of loyalists who made sure he never heard a single word of dissent or a single cry of hunger. Beside him sat his wife, Elena, a woman who was often described as the most powerful person in the country after her husband. She was 73, a self-proclaimed world-class scientist who held dozens of honorary degrees, most of which were obtained through political pressure. She was the architect of many of the regime's most restrictive policies, and she shared Nicolae's belief that the Romanian people owed them everything. She sat with her back straight, her face a mask of cold indignation, as she looked at the soldiers around her. For most Romanians, the 1980s had been a decade of profound and crushing darkness. To pay off the country's massive foreign debt, Nicolae had exported almost all of the nation's food and fuel. While the royal family lived in luxury, the average citizen stood in long lines for hours in the freezing cold just to buy a single loaf of bread or a liter of milk. Electricity was rationed to a few hours a day, and many people slept in their coats inside their own apartments. The silence of the hungry was the foundation of the state's power. The secret police, known as the Securitate, ensured that this silence remained unbroken. They had microphones in the walls of apartments and informants in every workplace. People learned to speak in whispers and to never trust their own neighbors. The fear was a physical presence in the air, a thick blanket that stifled every thought of rebellion. Nikolai believed that this system was invincible, that he had built a fortress of loyalty that would last for centuries. He had no idea how quickly a blanket of fear can be torn apart. The first crack in the fortress appeared in the city of Timisoara in mid-December. What started as a small protest over the eviction of a local priest quickly grew into a massive uprising. Nikolai ordered the army and the Securitate to fire on the crowds, believing that a show of force would end the trouble. But instead of retreating, the people found their courage in the face of the bullets. The news of the massacre spread across the country like a wildfire, fueled by the very radio stations that the regime had tried so hard to control. On December 21st, Nikolai organized a massive pro-government rally in Bucharest to show the world that he was still in control. He stood on the balcony of the Central Committee building, looking out at a crowd of over 100,000 people who had been bussed in for the occasion. He began his speech with his usual promises of salary increases and social benefits, expecting the familiar sound of organized applause. But about 8 minutes into his address, a sound began to rise from the back of the crowd that changed everything. It started as a low, rhythmic booing, a sound that Nikolai had likely never heard in person during his decades of rule. He stopped speaking, his mouth hanging open in confusion, his eyes darting across the sea of faces. He raised his hand, gesturing for silence, but the shouting only grew louder. The live television broadcast of the speech began to wobble and then went to a test pattern. In that moment, the entire nation saw the mask of the conductor slip. They saw a confused, elderly man who was suddenly and visibly afraid of his own children. The next morning, the protest had turned into a full-scale revolution. The army began to defect to the side of the people, and a massive crowd surrounded the Central Committee building. Nikolai and Elena realized that their security had vanished. They fled to the roof, where a white helicopter was waiting for them. As the aircraft lifted off, they could see the crowds breaking through the doors of the palace below. It was the last time they would ever see the city. They had spent 20 years trying to mold in their own image. The flight was a desperate, disorganized attempt to find a safe haven. The pilot, fearing that he would be shot down by the air defense systems, eventually told the Ceausescus that he had to land. They were left on the side of a road near the town of Targovište, trying to flag down cars like ordinary travelers. They were eventually picked up by a local man who turned them over to the military. The couple was taken to a small army base and placed in a cold, bare room, where they would spend their final days as prisoners of the revolution. On Christmas Day, a makeshift military tribunal was assembled at the base. The room was tiny, filled with the smell of damp concrete and the nervous energy of the officers and soldiers. There was no formal legal team for the defense, and the judges were men who had been taking orders from Nikolai just a few days earlier. The atmosphere was one of extreme haste. The revolutionaries were terrified that loyalist Securitate forces might attempt a rescue mission, and they wanted to end the regime once and for all before the sun went down. You are standing in the corner of that room, holding a camera that is recording every second of the proceedings. The light is poor, and the air is so cold that you can see your own breath every time you exhale. You watch as the elderly couple sits at the small table, their faces pale and their eyes wide. They look like characters from another century, two people who still believe they have the authority to command the room. The sound of the soldiers' boots on the floor is the only rhythm in a situation that has completely lost its sense of order. The lead prosecutor began reading the list of charges. They included the genocide of over 60,000 people, the destruction of the national economy, and the illegal seizure of state funds. Nikolai refused to recognize the authority of the court, repeatedly stating that he was the president of Romania and that he would only answer to the Grand National Assembly. He spoke with a trembling voice, but his words were still full of the old arrogance. He seemed unable to comprehend that the world he lived in just 3 days ago was gone forever. Elena was even more defiant. She interrupted the prosecutor several times, calling the officers traitors and telling them that she had raised them like her own children. She looked at the soldiers with a deep, burning contempt, as if she could simply order them to stop the trial through the sheer force of her will. She didn't seem to understand that the men in the room were no longer afraid of her name or her status. To them, she was no longer the world-renowned scientist, but a symbol of a decade of suffering that they were finally ending. The trial lasted less than an hour. The prosecutor presented no witnesses and no physical evidence, relying instead on the shared trauma of the nation and the public record of the regime's failures. The verdict was a foregone conclusion, a decision made in the streets of Bucharest and Timișoara long before the tribunal had even met. The lead judge stood up and announced that Nicolae and Elena Ceausescu were found guilty of all charges and were sentenced to death by a firing squad. The sentence was to be carried out immediately. The realization of the verdict seemed to hit the couple with a physical force. Nicolae slumped in his chair, his eyes fixed on the small wooden table. He began to hum a few bars of the Internationale, the anthem of the movement he had once championed but eventually betrayed. Elena began to shout, her voice high and shrill, pleading with the soldiers to let them speak to their children. She looked around the room for a friendly face, but she found only the cold, steady gaze of the men who had been chosen to carry out the execution. The soldiers moved in to bind the couple's hands with white nylon rope. Elena fought back, struggling against the young men as they tried to pull her arms behind her back. She kept shouting that she was their mother and that they should be ashamed of themselves. Nicolae didn't resist. He allowed his hands to be tied, his face a mask of quiet resignation. The process was fast and clinical, a final stripping away of their dignity before they were led out of the small room and into the freezing air of the base's interior courtyard. The courtyard was a bleak space, surrounded by yellow brick walls and guarded by soldiers with automatic rifles. The snow was beginning to fall again, the white flakes drifting down onto the cold pavement. A group of 3 soldiers had been selected as the firing squad. They stood a few yards away, their faces covered by their winter gear, their weapons held at the ready. They were all young men, part of the generation that had grown up in the darkness of the 1980s, and they looked at the couple with a mixture of fear and grim duty. As they were pushed toward the wall, Elena made one final request. She asked the soldiers not to tie their hands, stating that she and Nicolae wanted to die together, holding each other. Her voice had lost its shrill edge and was now a low, desperate whisper. The soldiers refused her request, continuing to position them against the yellow bricks. Nicolae stood with his head held high, looking toward the gray sky. He began to sing the national anthem, his voice thin and shaky in the biting wind. It was a final attempt to reclaim the identity of the nation he had lost. The execution happened with a speed that caught the cameraman off guard. Before the command to fire could even be fully heard, the 3 soldiers opened fire with their AK-47 rifles. They fired approximately 120 rounds in a matter of seconds, the rhythmic thumping of the automatic weapons echoing off the walls of the courtyard. Nicolae and Elena collapsed to the ground instantly, their bodies disappearing into a cloud of white dust and smoke from the impact of the bullets against the brick wall. The sound of the gunfire was the final note of the revolution. The silence that followed was absolute. The smoke cleared slowly, revealing the 2 figures lying on the cold pavement. They looked small and fragile in their expensive coats, no longer the larger-than-life figures who had dominated the nation's consciousness for 2 decades. The soldiers stood over them for a few seconds, their rifles still smoking, their breath visible in the cold air. They didn't feel like heroes. They felt like men who had just finished a difficult and necessary chore. The great conductor and his wife were gone, and the 1980s were effectively over. The footage of the trial and the moments after the execution was broadcast on Romanian national television that evening. The announcer told the nation that the Antichrist is dead, and a wave of celebration swept through the streets of Bucharest. People danced in the snow, hugging strangers and tearing down the portraits of Nicolae that had hung in every shop and office for years. It was a Christmas that no one in the country would ever forget, a day when the darkness finally broke and a new, uncertain era of freedom began to take its first breaths. I have often thought about that small wooden table in the room at Târgoviște. It is a strange thing to see how quickly the symbols of absolute power can be reduced to a piece of furniture in a damp basement. We build our lives around the idea that the structures of our society are permanent, but the history of Romania proves that everything can change in the span of a single afternoon. Power is a fragile mask, and once it is removed, the face underneath is often just as frightened and vulnerable as any other human being in the cold. The bodies of Nicolae and Elena were taken back to Bucharest and buried in secret in the Ghencea cemetery. The government feared that if people knew the location, the graves would either be desecrated or turned into a site of pilgrimage for those who still felt nostalgia for the old ways. For years, the graves remained unmarked, two simple mounds of earth among thousands of others. It was only much later, after the political situation had stabilized, that their names were finally added to the stone, a quiet acknowledgement of a chapter of history that the country was still trying to process. The 1980s in Romania are now remembered as a time of extreme sacrifice and the eventual triumph of the human spirit. The palaces that Nicolae built are still there, massive stone monuments to his ego that the new government has struggled to repurpose. The People's Palace, one of the largest buildings in the world, is now the home of the Romanian parliament, a place where the laws of a democracy are debated in the rooms where a dictator once planned his absolute rule. The building is a permanent reminder of the high cost of a single man's vision. Up to the present time, in 2026, the military base at Târgoviște has been turned into a museum. Visitors can walk into the tiny room where the trial took place and see the original wooden table and chairs. They can stand in the courtyard and look at the yellow brick wall, where the bullet holes from the 1989 execution have been preserved as a historical exhibit. It is a quiet, somber place that attracts travelers from all over the world, people who want to stand at the spot where the Iron Curtain finally fell for good in Eastern Europe. The memory of the Ceausescus is still a complicated subject in Romania today. While the majority of the population remembers the hunger and the fear of the 80s with horror, there is a small segment of the older generation that feels a sense of loss for the stability of the era. They visit the graves at Ghența on Nicolae's birthday, leaving red carnations and lighting candles. This lingering connection is a testament to the power of a regime to mold the psychology of its citizens over decades, even after the physical structures of that regime have been dismantled. The story of the Ceausescus is the final story of our journey through the 1980s. It was a decade that began with the rise of new technologies and ended with the fall of old empires. From the high society bars of New York to the rice fields of South Korea and the quiet offices of Athens, we have seen how the choices of a few can change the lives of millions. The world moved on from the 80s, but the scars left behind by these 12 stories are still visible in the laws we follow and the memories we keep in the quiet hours of the night. The transition from a world of absolute control to a world of absolute chaos can happen in the time it takes to pull a trigger or to speak a single word of dissent in a crowded square. We often look back at history and think we can see the patterns, but for the people living through these 12 stories, the future was always a mystery. They were simply people trying to survive, trying to find a moment of peace in a decade that was often defined by its violence. The silence of the Târgoviște courtyard is the same silence that follows every tragedy, a space where we are forced to think about what comes next. The sounds of the 80s, the clacking of the typewriters, the roar of the jet engines, and the rhythmic thumping of the automatic rifles have mostly faded into the white noise of history. We live in a world that is faster, louder, and more connected, yet the human capacity for both cruelty and courage remains exactly the same as it was 40 years ago. We tell these stories not just to remember the dead, but to understand the living. The darkness of the past is always there, a shadow that helps us to see the light of the present more clearly. As the snow continues to fall on the hills of Romania and the lights of Bucharest flicker in the distance, we leave the 1980s behind. The stories of the preppy killer, the otaku, the ghost of Hwaseong, and the fallen dictator are now parts of a map that we use to navigate the new century. They are reminders that even in the darkest decade, there are moments of profound truth that can only be found if we are willing to look into the shadows. Sleep well, stay safe, and remember that the quietest rooms often have the loudest histories.